My name is Victoria Sterling. I am 33 years old and I am a forensic accountant. They combed the burning wreckage of my car and legally declared me dead. Exactly 3 months later, I stood shivering on the porch of my own home, only to find my entire life erased. My husband Julian had sold everything we owned and married another woman. But Julian made one fatal miscalculation. He did not know the charred body they buried was not mine. Now he's going to pay the ultimate price. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that karma always catches up to those who betray us. The damp chill of the Seattle autumn bit through my thin jacket as I stepped out of the taxi. For 3 agonizing months, I had been trapped in a coma at a remote clinic deep in the Cascade Mountains. I woke up with nothing but fractured memories of the fiery crash. The elderly doctor who found me had no way to identify me until my memory returned last week. I borrowed cash for bus fare and came straight to my affluent neighborhood. I expected Julian to open the door with tears of disbelief and relief. I expected my beautiful $2.5 million home to wrap its arms around me. Instead, I stood on the welcome mat and fumbled with my keys. My hands shook from exhaustion, but I managed to slide the silver key into the deadbolt. It would not turn. I tried again, pressing my way against the heavy mahogany door. The lock had been changed. I took a step back, staring at the unfamiliar brass hardware. Confusion clouded my mind until the door suddenly swung open from the inside. A strange woman holding a toddler stared back at me with narrowed eyes. She asked me who I was and why I was trying to break into her house. The breath left my lungs. I stammered that this was my home. The woman looked at me with pity. She told me I had the wrong address. She said she and her husband bought this property from a grieving widower 2 months ago. Then she firmly shut the door in my face. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoed in the quiet suburban street. I stumbled backward down the porch steps, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. As a forensic accountant, my brain is trained to see the timeline. You do not just sell a luxury estate and clear probate in 3 short months. The paperwork alone takes much longer than that. Unless the paperwork was already prepared, unless my death was never a tragic accident, but rather a carefully orchestrated exit strategy. My dear husband Julian had planned all of this. He had wanted me permanently dead just to take absolutely everything I owned. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoed in my mind as I stumbled away from the porch of my former home. The cold Seattle wind whipped against my face, but I barely felt it. My mind was a chaotic storm of numbers, dates, and legal procedures. I was Victoria Sterling, a senior forensic accountant who spent her entire career unraveling complex financial webs for high-net-worth clients. Yet, I had completely missed the massive fraud happening inside my own marriage. I walked down the manicured sidewalk of the affluent neighborhood I had helped build, feeling entirely invisible. I was a ghost haunting her own life. I shoved my trembling hands into the pockets of my thin borrowed jacket. I had exactly $12 to my name. No credit cards, no driver license, no social security number. Legally, I did not exist. To the state of Washington, I was a pile of ashes buried in a closed casket. The gravity of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Without identification, I could not walk into a bank and demand my funds. I could not check into a hotel. I could not even go to the police without risking being thrown into a psychiatric ward as a delusional vagrant claiming to be a dead woman. I had to be extremely smart. I had to think exactly like the financial auditor I was trained to be. First, I needed to locate my husband Julian. My darling husband was a creature of intense habit and massive ego. Before my accident, his tech startup was bleeding capital, and we were constantly arguing about his reckless corporate spending. He always told me he needed to project extreme wealth to attract venture capitalists. If he had somehow cashed in my massive life insurance policy and liquidated our shared estate, he would not be hiding quietly in the suburbs. He would be flaunting his newly stolen fortune. I walked for hours, letting the physical exertion burn away the lingering weakness in my muscles from the coma. I navigated the familiar downtown Seattle streets, carefully avoiding the bright lights of coffee shops where someone might accidentally recognize my face. I headed straight for the luxury district near the waterfront. Julian had always obsessed over a specific ultra-modern high-rise building overlooking the Puget Sound. He used to complain endlessly that our sprawling suburban estate was too far from the city action. If he had millions of dollars in fresh stolen cash, that penthouse would absolutely be his first major purchase. My professional instincts were entirely correct. I stood across the street from the shimmering glass tower, hiding securely in the deep shadows of an old brick alleyway. The autumn rain started to fall in a slow, steady drizzle, plastering my dark hair to my forehead. I waited in the cold. My legs cramped and my stomach twisted with deep hunger, but my eyes never left the grand entrance of the building. Forensic accounting is 90% patience and 10% execution. I was fully willing to wait all night in the freezing rain if necessary. Just past 8 o'clock, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled up to the valet stand. The valet rushed forward to open the door. Out stepped Julian. He looked completely immaculate. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that I immediately recognized. It was an expensive suit he had purchased with my premium credit card just a month before I supposedly died in the mountains. He looked remarkably healthy, glowing with the arrogant confidence of a man who firmly believed he had outsmarted the entire world. There was absolutely no trace of grief on his handsome face. I saw no dark circles under his eyes from weeping for his lost wife. He tossed his keys to the valet with a wide, bright smile and walked confidently into the grand marble lobby. I backed further into the shadows of the alleyway, tilting my head up to scan the towering glass structure. A few minutes later, the bright lights flicked on in the top-floor penthouse suite. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a crystal-clear view from the dark street below. I watched closely as Julian walked out onto the expansive wrap-around balcony, holding 2 crystal glasses of champagne. A woman slowly followed him out into the night air. My breath caught painfully in my throat. At first, I did not recognize her at all. She was wearing a stunning silk emerald dress that clung perfectly to her newly styled figure. Her hair was professionally blown out, cascading down her shoulders in expensive golden waves. But as she turned her face to catch the glowing city light, the familiar features fell instantly into place. It was Harper. Harper was Julian's personal assistant at the tech startup. For 3 long years, she was the mousy, quiet girl who wore oversized wool cardigans and scurried nervously around the office, fetching black coffee and organizing his daily schedule. I had always felt genuinely sorry for her. I even convinced Julian to give her a generous financial bonus last Christmas because she claimed her elderly mother was terribly sick. Now the mousy assistant was standing proudly on a multi-million-dollar balcony, sipping expensive vintage champagne. Julian wrapped his free arm intimately around her waist, pulling her body flush against his. He leaned in and kissed her with a deep, passionate intensity he had not shown me in years. Harper raised her hand to rest it gently against his chest. Even from the dark street below, the ambient streetlights caught the brilliant, undeniable flash of heavy diamonds on her slender wrist. My stomach lurched violently. A dark wave of pure, visceral nausea washed over me, forcing me to lean heavily against the damp brick wall to keep my legs from completely collapsing beneath me. I knew that exact bracelet. I designed that custom diamond bracelet myself in Antwerp 5 years ago during a business trip. It was a one-of-a-kind piece. Harper was not just casually wearing my stolen jewelry. She was actively wearing my entire life. She was sleeping with my husband, living in a luxury penthouse bought with my stolen money, and enjoying a massive fortune I had painstakingly built from nothing. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, ragged breath of the wet city air. I fully expected the hot tears to finally come. I expected to fall to my weak knees and weep loudly at the overwhelming betrayal happening right above me. But the tears never arrived. The profound shock and the deep heartbreak instantly hardened into something entirely different within my chest. It turned into cold, calculated steel. The scattered pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my analytical mind with terrifying clarity. I thought back carefully to the cold morning of the fatal crash. I was driving my heavy vehicle down the winding mountain pass when my brakes completely gave out without any warning. The trusted mechanic had told me the day before that my vehicle was in absolutely perfect condition. Julian was originally supposed to take that car to the mechanic for its routine check. but he loudly claimed he was far too busy with investors. He had his assistant Harper handle it instead. Harper took my car to the auto shop. Harper brought it back to the house. The sudden catastrophic brake failure was not a tragic manufacturer defect. It was a carefully premeditated execution. Harper was not just a greedy little mistress who opportunistically swooped in to comfort a wealthy, grieving widower. She was an active participating accomplice in my brutal attempted murder. They coldly planned to kill me cash, the massive corporate insurance policy, liquidate all my hard-earned assets, and start a brand new glamorous life together in the city. They truly thought they had committed the perfect, flawless crime. They thought they were completely untouchable because they believed the primary victim was permanently turned to ash in a metal coffin. I slowly opened my eyes and stared back up at the glowing penthouse. The physical nausea was entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, icy mental clarity. The terrified, confused woman who woke up crying in a rural clinic was officially dead. In her place stood a master forensic auditor who was now completely prepared to dismantle their stolen empire brick by bloody brick. My primary goal immediately shifted from mere physical survival to absolute financial destruction. But I knew I could not just walk into a local police station and loudly accuse them of murder. I had absolutely no concrete evidence. My word against theirs would mean absolutely nothing, especially since Julian now possessed the immense financial power to hire an entire army of elite defense attorneys to crush me in court. If I foolishly revealed myself too soon, Julian would instantly realize his grave mistake. He would simply find a faster, quieter way to finish the bloody job he started in those mountains. I had to remain completely dead to the world while I meticulously gathered undeniable proof of their heinous crimes. I needed to covertly trace every single stolen dollar of my missing money. I needed to secretly find the mechanic they undoubtedly paid off to cut my brake lines. I needed to quietly uncover the fraudulent death certificate they used to illegally claim the life insurance payout. To achieve all of that, I had to operate entirely in the deep shadows. I needed to become a silent ghost that could seamlessly hack into their private bank accounts, intercept their secure communications, and track their daily movements without ever making a single sound. The crucial first step was securing a powerful ally. I could not do this complex operation alone with $12 wet dollars in my pocket and no legal identity. I desperately needed someone who had high-level access to the legal system, someone who secretly hated Julian just as much as I did right now. I needed someone who would actually believe I was standing in front of them and not a crazy hallucination. My analytical mind raced through the long list of people in my former life. My parents were deceased. My old friends were heavily tied to Julian and his tech company boards. I could not trust a single one of them with my life. Then a specific name sparked brightly in my mind. Maya. Maya was Julian's adopted sister. She was a brilliant and utterly ruthless assistant district attorney who had spent her entire adult life deeply despising Julian and his endless toxic greed. Maya always saw right through his charismatic fake facade. She explicitly warned me not to marry him years ago. She told me he would eventually drain me dry and leave me with nothing. I had foolishly ignored her harsh warnings, completely blinded by young, naive love. But right now, Maya was the absolute only person in this city who possessed the legal power, the required resources, and the personal motive to help me tear his life down. I pulled the wet collar of my damp jacket up against the chilling night wind. I took one last long look at Julian and Harper laughing together on their balcony, completely unaware that their quiet executioner was actively watching them from the dark alley below. Enjoy the vintage champagne, Julian. Enjoy the warm penthouse and my custom diamonds, because very soon I am going to take absolutely everything back and leave you with nothing but a prison cell. I turned my back on the shimmering glass tower and walked out of the alleyway, disappearing silently into the rainy Seattle night, ready to begin my war. The freezing rain soaked completely through the thin fabric of my borrowed jacket as I walked rapidly away from the glittering high-rise, where my husband was currently celebrating my murder. I had to keep moving because stopping meant freezing to death on the dark streets of Seattle. My mind raced violently through the harsh tactical realities of my current situation. I was legally dead, with zero financial resources, and absolutely no physical identification to my name. If I foolishly walked into a local police station right now, I would be instantly dismissed as a traumatized vagrant or locked in a psychiatric ward. I desperately needed someone powerful inside the legal system. I needed someone who possessed immense legal authority and a deep ingrained hatred for Julian. There was exactly one person in the entire state of Washington who fit that specific description perfectly. Maya. Maya was Julian's adopted sister, and she was a brilliant, fiercely intelligent African-American assistant district attorney. Maya had always seen right through Julian and his charming facade. While the rest of the business world was entirely captivated by his charismatic tech founder persona, Maya saw the greedy, calculating parasite hiding underneath the expensive suits. She had explicitly warned me not to marry him years ago. She bluntly told me he would eventually bleed my bank accounts dry and leave me broken. I had been far too young and blind in love to listen to her warnings, but right now Maya was my absolute only lifeline in this city. I knew Maya always worked extremely late on Tuesdays. She was a relentless workaholic prosecutor who thrived on crushing corrupt politicians and wealthy white-collar criminals in court. I navigated the dark, slick city streets, heading directly toward the King County District Attorney main office building. The massive concrete structure was highly intimidating, but I clearly remembered the specific security blind spots in the underground employee parking garage. Julian used to complain endlessly about how insecure the employee lot was when he picked Maya up for family dinners in the past. I waited patiently in the cold alleyway and slipped quietly past the automated security gate just as a commercial cleaning crew van exited the facility. The heavy toxic smell of vehicle exhaust and damp concrete immediately filled my lungs as I descended quickly into the dimly lit subterranean levels. The stale air down here was slightly warmer than the freezing autumn rain outside, but my exhausted body was still violently shivering from the shock. I found her vehicle easily among the empty spaces. It was a pristine black luxury sedan, parked neatly in her designated reserved spot near the main elevator banks. I crouched down silently behind a thick concrete support pillar, wiping the wet, tangled hair out of my eyes and forcing my rapid breathing to slow down. I waited in the shadows for what felt like agonizing hours. The quiet isolation of the underground garage amplified every single ambient sound. The dripping water from the exposed ceiling pipes sounded exactly like ticking clocks counting down my life. My empty stomach cramped painfully from hunger, but I aggressively ignored the physical pain. I focused my vision entirely on the heavy steel doors of the employee elevator, waiting for my one chance at survival. Just past midnight, the heavy steel doors finally chimed loudly and slid open. The sharp, authoritative click of expensive high heels echoed sharply across the empty concrete floor. It was Maya. Even visibly exhausted after a grueling 14-hour legal shift, she radiated absolute intimidating power. She wore a sharp-tailored navy blue trench coat over her strict courtroom suit, and she carried a heavy leather briefcase loaded with case files. Her expression was stern and deeply focused. I watched her approach her vehicle, fishing her electronic car keys out of her deep coat pocket. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, threatening to crack them. I had to execute this ambush perfectly. If I startled her too much, her strict self-defense training would take over. I took a deep, steadying breath and stepped out from behind the concrete pillar into the pale, flickering fluorescent light. I did not run toward her. I stood perfectly still, about 10 feet away from her car, and spoke her name softly into the quiet garage. Maya froze instantly in her tracks. Her head snapped violently in my direction, and her dark eyes went wide with absolute terror. For a split second, I saw the natural color completely drain from her beautiful face. She dropped her heavy leather briefcase in pure shock. It hit the hard concrete floor with a loud echoing thud that made me flinch. Before I could say another reassuring word, her intense urban survival instincts kicked in aggressively. She reached swiftly into her trench coat pocket and pulled out a small black canister of police-grade pepper spray, aiming the nozzle directly at my face. Her hand was trembling slightly, but her combat stance was perfectly balanced and ready to strike. "Stay back!" she shouted loudly, her voice cracking with raw, genuine panic. "I do not know who you are or what kind of sick, twisted joke this is, but if you take one more step toward me, I will blind you and call security." I raised both of my hands very slowly, keeping my palms open and highly visible in the dim light. Maya, please just listen to me, I whispered desperately, my voice hoarse and raspy from the freezing cold. It is me. It is Tori. I am not dead. Maya shook her head aggressively, taking a defensive step backward toward the safety of her car door. You are a sick liar, she yelled angrily. Victoria is dead. I went to her funeral 3 months ago. I personally saw her heavy casket go into the ground. Whoever paid you to do this is going to federal prison for a very long time. Get away from me right now. I knew simple physical resemblance was nowhere near enough to convince a skeptical prosecutor. I was gaunt, pale, and heavily bruised from months in a medical coma. I looked exactly like a walking ghost. I had to immediately hit her with undeniable factual data that only the real Victoria Sterling would know. Maya listened to me very closely, I said, speaking clearly and rapidly over the hum of the garage ventilation. When Julian brought me to your law school graduation dinner 5 years ago, you wore a stunning yellow silk dress. You accidentally spilled dark red wine on the skirt, and we spent 20 panicked minutes locked in the restaurant bathroom, scrubbing it with club soda, while you cried endlessly about failing the state bar exam. You made me swear on my life I would never tell Julian because you knew he would aggressively use that moment of weakness against you. And you did not fail the bar exam, Maya. You passed it with the highest recorded score in your entire graduating class. Maya lowered the black pepper spray canister by a fraction of an inch. Her breathing was ragged and shallow. Her dark eyes searched my gaunt face, desperately looking for the psychological lie. Only you and I were in that locked bathroom, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the echoing garage. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance safely. I am truly alive, Maya. My car brakes completely failed on the steep mountain pass. I was trapped in a deep coma in an off-the-grid rural medical clinic for 3 entire months. I just woke up last week. I came home tonight to surprise Julian and found a completely strange family living inside my house. Julian sold absolutely everything I owned. He married his assistant Harper. Maya let out a sharp, gasping breath. The pepper spray canister slipped completely from her weakened grip and clattered loudly onto the hard concrete floor. She closed the remaining distance between us in 3 quick, decisive strides. She reached out with heavily shaking hands and grabbed my wet shoulders. Her physical grip was incredibly strong and grounding. She slid her warm fingers up to my freezing neck, pressing firmly against my cold, wet skin until she found my carotid artery. The steady, rhythmic beating of my pulse against her fingertips was the final, undeniable biological proof she needed. A choked, emotional sob aggressively escaped her throat. She pulled me forcefully into a crushing embrace, burying her face deeply into my wet, freezing shoulder. "You are freezing cold!" she cried loudly, her strict professional exterior finally crumbling into a mess of genuine shock and overwhelming relief. "You're actually alive and standing here. Oh my God, Tori, you are really alive." I hugged her back tightly, feeling the very first shred of actual safety I had experienced in 3 long, horrific months. But the comforting safety was extremely fleeting. The cold, harsh reality of my current legal situation demanded immediate tactical action. I pulled back gently, looking her dead in the tear-filled eyes. I am alive, Maya. But Julian actively tried to make sure I was not. He hired someone to cut my brake lines. He meticulously planned my execution. Maya's facial expression instantly shifted from tearful relief to a cold, terrifying, vengeful anger. She looked quickly around the empty parking garage, her elite prosecutor instincts aggressively taking over the situation. "We absolutely cannot stay out here in the open," she said firmly. "Get in the car right now before security patrols this level." She quickly unlocked the vehicle doors and shoved me safely into the leather passenger seat, turning on the powerful engine and blasting the digital heater to maximum capacity. The intense warm air rushed rapidly over my violently shivering body, but the deep, terrifying chill inside my bones remained steadfast. Maya locked all the doors and pulled out her highly encrypted government work phone. She intentionally did not turn on the overhead cabin light, keeping us completely cloaked in the dark protective shadows of her tinted windows. She stared intensely at me, gripping the leather steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned bright white. "If you're sitting right next to me, actually breathing air, then we have a massive catastrophic legal problem on our hands," she said, her voice dropping to a very serious, hushed whisper. "I personally watched Julian identify your remains at the county morgue. I read the official county death certificate with my own eyes. I asked her how that was even legally possible without my actual body. I told her the vehicle caught fire, but there was absolutely no way they found my body inside, because I had shattered the window, crawled out into the brush, and been found miles away by a local hunter who took me to the rural clinic." Maya let out a heavy, frustrated breath, shaking her head in pure legal disbelief. "Tori, they found a severely burned body trapped inside the driver's seat of your ruined SUV. The chemical fire was so incredibly intense that standard visual identification was entirely impossible for the authorities. The county medical examiner had to rely exclusively on matched dental records to declare you legally deceased. Julian personally provided your official dental records to the coroner the very next morning after the crash. The corrupt coroner quickly confirmed a perfect match and signed your official death certificate within 48 hours. It was the fastest closed investigation I have ever witnessed in my entire legal career." My mind forcefully reeled backward. The senior forensic accountant living inside my brain began rapidly processing the horrifying new data. If I was not trapped in the burning car, then Julian intentionally transported a dead body to the crash site, placed them inside my vehicle, and deliberately swapped the dental x-rays to completely fool the medical examiner. He had successfully bribed a government official to fast-track my legal demise. I looked at Maya, the absolute horror fully dawning on me. Why would he rush it so desperately, I asked her. Why take such a massive federal risk with a fake body and forged medical records? Maya turned fully to face me, her dark eyes burning with pure, unfiltered rage. Because his precious tech company was completely bankrupt, Tori. He was drowning in massive corporate debt, and his elite venture capitalists were aggressively threatening to file federal fraud charges against him for illegally misappropriating their private funds. He desperately needed an immediate massive injection of untraceable liquid cash to save his startup and avoid going to federal prison. I stared at her, the final puzzle pieces snapping together violently in my analytical brain. The corporate life insurance policy, I whispered in complete shock. Maya nodded slowly, confirming my darkest absolute suspicion. Yes, she said coldly, the executive corporate life insurance policy. Exactly 3 days after the corrupt coroner signed your fake death certificate, Julian submitted the massive financial claim. Because his failing tech company was legally listed as the primary corporate beneficiary upon the tragic death of its chief operating officer, the greedy insurance company expedited the massive payout. He successfully cashed out a $5 million life insurance policy on your life, Tori. He used your supposed tragic death to completely wipe out his entire corporate debt in one single day. Then he quietly sold your $2.5 million suburban estate, liquidated your private stock portfolio, and married his willing accomplice Harper a month later. The sheer unprecedented scale of his calculated betrayal was absolutely staggering to comprehend. Julian had not just wanted a simple divorce to get out of our marriage. He had meticulously orchestrated a multi-million-dollar financial massacre. He had successfully executed a flawless corporate bailout using my spilled blood as his personal currency. He had murdered an innocent, unknown person, placed their corpse in my burning car, bribed a medical examiner, and stolen absolutely everything I had spent my entire adult life painstakingly building. And right now, he was sitting proudly in a waterfront penthouse, drinking expensive vintage champagne with his murderous new wife. Maya watched my face closely, waiting for me to break down into hysterical tears. She reached into her center console and handed me a dry, clean towel to wipe my wet, freezing hair. "What exactly do you want to do, Tori?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady and entirely serious. "Legally, I can drive you straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters right now. We can walk safely into the lobby, declare you are miraculously alive, and legally demand a full federal investigation into the unidentified burned body and the fraudulent insurance payout." I calmly took the soft towel from her hands, but I did not dry my wet hair. I gripped the thick fabric incredibly tightly in my cold fists, feeling the raw, surging power of absolute fury, actively replacing every single ounce of fear in my tired body. "No," I said coldly, staring straight ahead through the windshield. If we go blindly to the federal authorities right now, Julian will instantly hire the most expensive defense lawyers in the entire country. He currently has $5 million of my stolen money to aggressively fight me in federal court. He will cry and claim he was heavily grieving and made an honest mistake with the dental records. He will successfully shift all the blame to the corrupt medical examiner. He will throw Harper under the bus to save himself. He will tie this massive case up in endless civil litigation for 10 years, while I am forced to sleep on a small cot in a public women's shelter. He absolutely does not get to walk away with a comfortable plea deal, Maya. He does not get to legally keep my hard-earned money while the slow courts figure this complex mess out. I want to destroy him completely from the inside out. I want to tear down his precious tech company, freeze every single stolen financial asset he has, and put him permanently in a cold federal cage where his stolen money cannot save him. Maya's lips slowly curled into a very slow, highly dangerous smile. The powerful assistant district attorney, who had spent her entire life despising her adopted brother and his endless greed, was now fully unleashed. I always knew you were the smartest person in that entire family, Tori, she said firmly. Tell me exactly what you need me to legally do. I looked out the tinted car window at the dark concrete wall of the underground garage. I need covert access to his internal company servers, I replied calmly. I need to forensically track the massive insurance payout through his hidden shell companies. And I need to stay completely legally dead while I silently build the financial guillotine. The quiet ghost of Victoria Sterling had just found her powerful inside advantage, and Julian's stolen empire was about to burn completely to the ground. Maya drove us in complete silence to her secure high-rise apartment on the edge of the city. The moment the heavy wooden door locked behind us, the reality of our clandestine operation settled into my bones. Her apartment was a stark contrast to the flamboyant luxury Julian craved. It was minimal practical and filled with towering stacks of legal case files. She tossed me a pair of dry sweatpants and a heavy wool sweater. I changed quickly in her guest bathroom, watching the freezing rain beat against the frosted glass window. When I walked out into the living area, Maya had already placed her highly encrypted government laptop on the kitchen island. Beside it was a steaming mug of black coffee. I wrapped my cold hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into my numb fingers. I sat down on the metal bar stool and stared at the glowing screen. We needed to prove the dental records were completely forged, but Julian had not just walked away from my supposed grave and left things to chance. Maya warned me that he had hired an elite private corporate security firm immediately after the funeral. They were legally tasked with guarding his new tech headquarters, but they also aggressively monitored any inquiries into my accident. If a random private investigator or a curious insurance adjuster started asking questions about my closed case, Julian would be notified within minutes. Maya pulled up a secondary secure monitor and logged into the county database using her high-level assistant district attorney credentials. She explained that requesting the physical autopsy file through normal channels would instantly trigger an alert to Julian's legal team. But as a senior prosecutor, she had backdoor access to the raw digital evidence servers for active criminal trials. She could quietly pull the archived digital copies of the medical examiner report under the guise of cross-referencing an unrelated arson case. While she carefully navigated the complex legal firewall, I cracked my knuckles and placed my hands on the keyboard of her primary laptop. It was time to do exactly what I did best. I took a deep breath of the rich coffee aroma and dove headfirst into the digital labyrinth of Julian's financial life. I knew his tech startup was bleeding capital before my crash, but I needed to see exactly how close he was to total ruin. Using a series of secure virtual private networks Maya had installed for her own investigations, I bypassed the basic public financial registries and accessed the deeper corporate filings. The background of his failing business was a catastrophic mess of pure reckless greed. Julian Tech Startup was supposed to revolutionize cloud storage algorithms, but the product was entirely vaporware. He had sold a brilliant lie to a board of ruthless venture capitalists. By the time I supposedly died in those mountains, his company was operating on negative margins. He had burned through $80 million of investor funding on lavish marketing parties, expensive downtown office spaces, and private jet rentals. The venture capitalists were not just angry, they were actively preparing a massive federal lawsuit for extreme fiduciary negligence. Julian was staring down the barrel of a 20-year federal prison sentence for corporate fraud. He desperately needed a massive injection of untraceable liquid cash to quietly pay back the most aggressive investors and keep the illusion alive until he could launch his initial public offering. My tragic, fiery death was the absolute perfect solution to his massive financial nightmare. I opened a new encrypted window and began tracing the money. The $5 million life insurance payout did not go directly into his personal checking account. Julian was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He knew a sudden massive deposit would look highly suspicious to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Instead, the insurance company wired the $5 million to a corporate trust account designated for the surviving spouse. From there, Julian executed a classic layering technique. I watched the digital trail as he fractured the massive payout into dozens of smaller wire transfers. He sent the money out of the country through a complex web of anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. To an untrained eye, it looked like standard international vendor payments for tech hardware. But I was a senior forensic accountant, and I recognized his sloppy digital handwriting immediately. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously untangling the knot. I tracked every single penny as it bounced from offshore accounts back into his domestic corporate ledgers. He was actively laundering the blood money back into his own failing startup, disguised as anonymous angel investments. The silence in the apartment was broken only by the rapid, rhythmic clicking of our keyboards. The sun began to rise over the Seattle skyline, casting a cold, gray light through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My eyes burned from staring at the bright screen, but my adrenaline was surging too powerfully to stop. Maya let out a sharp, sudden breath and leaned back in her chair. She had successfully bypassed the county security tripwires and downloaded the complete digital autopsy file for the Jane Doe buried in my grave. She dragged the heavy PDF file onto our shared network folder. I clicked open the document, and we stared at the horrifying reality of what Julian had done. The medical examiner report detailed a devastating chemical fire that had completely destroyed the victim's physical features. The official cause of death was listed as severe thermal trauma, but the attached dental x-rays were the absolute smoking gun. Maya pointed to the grainy black and white images on the screen. The dental records Julian submitted to the county morgue perfectly matched the teeth found in the burned skull. But there was a massive glaring problem. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart pounding in my chest. I pointed to a specific molar on the left side of the jaw. I told Maya to look closely at that specific tooth. 3 years ago, I had a severe infection, and my dentist had to perform a root canal and place a distinctive titanium crown on that exact molar. The X-ray on the screen showed a perfectly healthy natural tooth with absolutely no titanium crown. Julian had not just swapped my dental records, he had completely fabricated an entirely new set of medical files using the digital signature of my actual dentist. He likely hacked into my clinic database or paid someone on the inside to alter the records before submitting them to the county. It was a highly sophisticated, premeditated crime, but forging the dental records was only half of the equation. He still needed a corrupt medical examiner to ignore the obvious discrepancies and officially sign the death certificate without asking any difficult questions. I minimized the autopsy file and opened a new search window. I asked Maya for the exact name of the county medical examiner who handled my case. She scanned the bottom of the digital report and read the name aloud. Dr. Richard Vance. I typed his name into the public financial databases, running a deep sweep on his personal assets and recent real estate transactions. For a few minutes, the search turned up nothing unusual. He was a 60-year-old public servant with a modest state salary and a standard pension plan. But I knew Julian had to pay him off somehow. You do not just convince a senior government official to participate in a multi-million-dollar murder cover-up with a simple handshake. I expanded my search parameters beyond the borders of Washington state, digging into international wire transfers flagged by the Federal Reserve. I cross-referenced Dr. Vance's social security number with offshore banking registries. Suddenly, The screen lit up with a massive red flag. Exactly 1 week after he officially signed my fraudulent death certificate, Dr. Richard Vance submitted his immediate resignation to the county morgue, citing unexpected health issues. 2 days after his abrupt retirement, a wire transfer of $400,000 cleared through a private bank in the Bahamas. I traced the origin of that specific wire transfer directly back to one of the anonymous shell companies Julian was using to launder my life insurance money. But the terrifying discoveries did not stop there. I pulled up the International Property Registry for the Baja California region. Less than a month ago, Dr. Richard Vance purchased a sprawling luxury villa in Cabo San Lucas completely in cash. He had sold his modest Seattle home, abandoned his entire life in the Pacific Northwest, and vanished across the southern border to live like a king on the blood money he accepted to legally erase my existence. Maya stared at the screen, her jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered in her cheek. She whispered that the corruption was far deeper than she ever imagined. Julian had completely compromised a senior medical examiner. If Dr. Vance was safely hiding in a luxury villa in Mexico, beyond the immediate reach of American law enforcement, we could not simply drag him into an interrogation room and force him to confess. We were dealing with an international conspiracy funded by my own stolen wealth. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms over my chest. The cold, logical part of my brain took complete control. I told Maya that we did not need to drag the doctor back from Mexico. We just needed to prove that Julian paid him the exact same week he signed the fake death certificate. We had the financial records proving the massive bribe. We had the autopsy file proving the dental records were completely fake. We had the clear motive of Julian failing business and the $5 million life insurance payout. But Maya shook her head slowly, her legal mind already searching for the inevitable loopholes Julian expensive defense attorneys would aggressively exploit. She explained that financial circumstantial evidence was incredibly powerful, but it was still just circumstantial. A clever defense lawyer could argue that Julian was simply investing in Mexican real estate and the corrupt doctor stole the money. They could claim the dental records were an honest administrative error made by a grieving husband. To completely destroy Julian and ensure he never saw the outside of a federal prison cell, we needed absolute undeniable proof of his direct involvement in the embezzlement and the murder plot. We needed to catch him actively managing the stolen funds. We needed to physically plant a device inside his own highly secure tech startup. We needed a digital wiretap directly on his primary workstation. I looked at Maya, my mind racing through the dangerous tactical possibilities. Julian, elite corporate security firm, monitored every single person who entered that high-rise office building. They required biometric scans, encrypted keycards, and extensive background checks for all employees and visitors. Sneaking into his corporate headquarters would be incredibly difficult and highly dangerous. If I was caught on a security camera, my entire cover would be instantly blown, and Julian would know I was hunting him. But there was absolutely no other way. I had to walk directly into the lion den. I turned back to the glowing laptop screen, pulling up the corporate directory for Julian Tech Startup. I needed a flawless disguise and a perfect cover story. I needed to become someone entirely new, someone who had a legitimate professional reason to bypass his elite security and sit directly at his personal computer. The ghost of Victoria Sterling was about to put on a new mask and walk straight back into her husband's life, ready to burn his empire to the ground. The sharp chemical smell of dark brown hair dye filled Maya's small guest bathroom as I prepared to completely erase my former identity. I stared into the fogged mirror, watching Victoria Sterling disappear down the porcelain drain, along with my old life. I cut my long flowing hair into a blunt, sharp bob that framed my face in a severe, uncompromising way. I slipped on a pair of thick-framed glasses that slightly magnified my eyes and completely altered the structural balance of my cheekbones. Maya had called in a massive, dangerous favor from a former criminal informant who specialized in high-level corporate espionage and identity theft. By sunrise, I was no longer a betrayed dead wife seeking petty revenge. I was Valerie Vance, a senior compliance auditor representing an elite independent oversight firm from Chicago. Maya handed me a thick forged dossier and a heavily encrypted smart badge. She warned me very strictly that Julian corporate security team used military-grade biometric scanners at all primary access points. She assured me the badge was a flawless duplicate, cloned from an active vendor, but the ultimate test would be walking through the front doors. I put on a tailored dark grey suit that felt exactly like heavy tactical armor. My hands were trembling slightly as I buttoned the stiff jacket, but my mind was violently focused. I was walking directly into the lion den to face the man who ordered my execution. The morning commute into downtown Seattle was a blur of grey rain and heavy chaotic traffic. I approached the towering glass headquarters of Julian tech startup with a steady, measured pace. The massive modern building was a towering monument to his fragile ego, paid for with stolen venture capital and ultimately funded by my own spilled blood. I pushed aggressively through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the pristine marble lobby. The air conditioning was freezing cold, but a hot bead of nervous sweat rolled slowly down my spine. Two heavily armed security guards stood rigidly beside a row of digital turnstiles, monitoring every person who entered. I walked confidently toward the main reception desk, projecting the cold, irritated aura of a busy corporate auditor who had 100 other important places to be. I handed my forged credential to the stern security director. He swiped the magnetic strip through his main terminal and stared at his screen. The system blinked bright green. He handed the badge back to me and politely told me to proceed directly to the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor. My burning lungs finally took in a full, deep breath of air as I stepped into the empty glass elevator. As the floors rapidly ticked upward, the familiar scent of the corporate building hit me. It smelled like fresh espresso, expensive leather, and absolute financial desperation. I walked out onto the expansive executive floor, keeping my head held high and my expression completely unreadable. The entire architectural layout was specifically designed to intimidate visitors. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the Puget Sound below. I was escorted into the primary glass boardroom by a highly nervous junior assistant who kept apologizing for the mess on the table. I sat down in the heavy oak chair, opening my leather briefcase and meticulously arranging my fake audit documents. I placed my bare hands flat against the cool, polished wood, forcing my rapid, terrified pulse to slow down to a steady, manageable rhythm. I was completely alone in the silent room for exactly 3 agonizing minutes before the heavy glass door swung open. Julian walked in. The immediate, visceral impact of seeing him up close was entirely different from safely watching him on a dark city balcony the night before. My heart slammed violently against my ribcage, threatening to crack the bone. Every single primal survival instinct in my tired body screamed at me to run away immediately. This was the exact man who had looked me deeply in the eyes, kissed my forehead tenderly, and then calmly handed my car keys to a paid assassin. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that I had personally bought him for our 3rd wedding anniversary. He looked completely relaxed and rested, radiating that toxic, charismatic energy he always used to easily manipulate everyone around him. He walked straight toward me, extending his right hand with a wide, polished corporate smile. He introduced himself as the Chief Executive Officer, speaking with absolute supreme confidence. He looked directly into my eyes, and he absolutely did not see his murdered wife looking back at him. He saw exactly what he expected to see, which was a tedious external corporate auditor named Valerie. I stood up tall and shook his hand firmly. His skin was incredibly warm. The physical contact made my empty stomach churn with pure burning acid, but my face remained an absolute mask of cold stone. I introduced myself as Valerie, keeping my voice a full octave lower than usual, and completely stripping away any trace of my normal rhythmic cadence. I told him my independent firm was hired directly by his primary venture capital investors to conduct a routine hardware compliance audit ahead of his highly anticipated initial public offering. Julian laughed softly, waving his hand dismissively in the air. He said he fully welcomed the random audit and proudly claimed his tech company had absolutely nothing to hide from anyone. He was so incredibly deeply arrogant. He truly believed he was the smartest, most untouchable person in the entire skyscraper. He sat down directly across from me, opening his primary workstation laptop and placing it squarely on the boardroom table. This was the exact primary machine he used every single day to orchestrate his massive international financial crimes. I knew the tiny physical keystroke logger I desperately needed to plant was currently hidden safely inside the hollow plastic casing of my black ink pen, resting innocently right next to my legal pad. I just needed him to look away for a few seconds. I began the tedious audit process, asking him a long series of highly technical and deeply boring questions about server encryption protocols and cloud storage redundancies. I intentionally used the driest, most monotonous professional voice possible, designed to put his hyperactive mind to sleep. I watched his dark eyes slowly glaze over with extreme boredom. Julian had never actually understood the complex real technology behind his own startup company. He was merely a loud salesman, aggressively pushing a fraudulent digital product to gullible old men with deep pockets. As I droned on endlessly about data compliance laws and federal regulations, I noticed his personal cell phone light up brightly on the table. It was a text message from Harper. He glanced down at the glowing screen, and a sudden look of deep, intense annoyance flashed across his handsome face. I seized the tactical opening immediately. I casually mentioned that I would quickly need to verify the hardware serial numbers on all the primary executive terminals, starting right now with his specific laptop. I asked him to log into the main administrative dashboard so I could record the system properties. Julian leaned forward and typed his complex master password into the laptop keyboard. He was so entirely distracted by Harper's annoying message that he did not even bother to cover his hands. I mentally memorized the rapid keystrokes instantly, but I still desperately needed the physical logger installed to quietly capture the encrypted offshore bank credentials he would inevitably use later that night. Once the secure administrative dashboard fully loaded, I slid my heavy chair much closer to his side of the long wooden table. I pointed to a complex wall of diagnostic code on the screen and asked him to carefully explain a specific routing anomaly I pretended to see. He leaned in close, squinting hard at the bright screen, clearly confused by the advanced technical jargon he did not understand. Then his private office phone rang loudly from his large desk across the massive room. I politely suggested he go take the urgent call while I ran a very quick manual diagnostic check on the rear hardware ports. He hesitated for a brief fraction of a second, staring at his ringing phone, but it kept ringing loudly and persistently. He stood up, quickly buttoning his expensive suit jacket, and walked rapidly across the expansive boardroom toward his private desk, completely turning his back to me. I had exactly 10 seconds to execute the trap. I twisted the plastic cap off my black ink pen. The tiny metallic keystroke logger slid silently into my waiting, sweaty palm. It was exactly the size of a small fingernail and designed to look exactly like a standard wireless mouse receiver. I reached carefully behind the glowing screen of his laptop, my trembling fingers brushing against the warm aluminum casing. My hands were shaking so violently from the massive adrenaline spike that I nearly dropped the tiny device onto the floor. I forced myself to inhale a deep, rigid breath, pulling all the cold, strict discipline of my years of forensic training directly to the surface. I blindly found the hidden rear hardware port with my index finger. I pushed the tiny logger firmly into the empty slot until it clicked softly and securely into place. I immediately grabbed his actual wireless mouse receiver and plugged it directly into the back of my planted device, creating a seamless, invisible digital bridge. The entire dangerous hardware modification took exactly 8 seconds to complete. I quickly pulled my hands back and placed them neatly and quietly in my lap, just as Julian hung up the office phone and turned back around. He walked slowly back to the table, sighing heavily and complaining loudly about overly demanding investors ruining his morning. He sat down confidently and grabbed his wireless mouse to close the dashboard. He clicked the screen. The mouse worked absolutely perfectly. The hidden keystroke logger was now actively recording every single master password, every private encrypted message, and every secure offshore banking login he would ever type on that machine. The digital trap was fully set and armed. He looked at me with that fake, charming smile and asked if the diagnostic check was complete. I looked right back into the dark eyes of my attempted murderer and smiled a cold, hollow, highly professional smile. I told him the hardware was functioning flawlessly. I methodically packed my forged documents back into my leather briefcase, feeling a massive surging wave of highly dangerous power wash over me. I had successfully breached his impenetrable fortress, and he had absolutely no idea that the silent architect of his impending absolute destruction was sitting right in front of him. I stood up gracefully and thanked him for his valuable executive time. He politely escorted me to the heavy glass boardroom doors, completely unaware that the countdown to his total financial ruin and federal imprisonment had just officially begun. The ghost had successfully planted the bomb, and all I had to do now was wait patiently in the shadows for the absolute perfect public moment to detonate his entire stolen life. The heavy glass doors closed firmly behind Julian, leaving me entirely alone in the expansive boardroom for the second time this morning. I did not waste a single valuable second. My hands moved rapidly and silently over my encrypted laptop, pulling the raw unedited data directly from the hidden physical keystroke logger I had just successfully planted on his machine. I initiated a direct localized download of his highly hidden offshore banking ledgers, using the administrative network access he had carelessly left wide open on his glowing screen. A small gray digital progress bar suddenly appeared on my high-resolution monitor, slowly filling with a bright neon green color as the massive, highly encrypted financial files transferred into my secure local hard drive. These specific digital files contained the absolute undeniable proof of his massive corporate embezzlement and the exact international routing numbers he explicitly used to pay the corrupt medical examiner in Mexico. The green progress bar crawled agonizingly slowly, reaching 30%, then inching toward 40. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, echoing loudly in my own ears. I knew Julian could easily return at any moment from his phone call. To completely avoid looking highly suspicious, if he suddenly walked back into the room, I stood up gracefully and gathered my empty white ceramic coffee cup. I walked calmly out of the glass boardroom and headed straight down the plush, dark, carpeted hallway toward the primary executive break room. I desperately needed to maintain the absolute perfect illusion of a bored, tedious compliance auditor taking a mundane morning coffee break while my specialized computer software finished the critical data extraction. I pushed open the heavy frosted glass door of the modern break room and walked directly toward the sleek stainless steel espresso machine. That was the exact moment I heard the sharp, distinctive, highly aggressive clicking of expensive designer heels echoing rapidly down the quiet executive corridor. My blood ran instantly cold. The heavy break room door swung open incredibly wide, and Harper walked confidently inside. She was absolutely no longer the mousy, quiet personal assistant I distinctly remembered from 3 long years ago. She wore a stunning, pure white tailored designer blazer and carried a rare, exclusive handbag that cost significantly more than most luxury vehicles. Her long blonde hair was styled flawlessly, falling in perfect golden waves, and she moved with the intense, arrogant entitlement of a powerful woman who fully believed she owned the entire corporate building. She had arrived completely unannounced for a surprise romantic lunch date with her wealthy new husband. She stopped dead in her tracks the very second she saw me standing quietly by the cold marble counter. Her sharp, piercing, icy blue eyes scanned my entire body from head to toe, evaluating me like a potential threat. For a brief, terrifying moment, the entire world seemed to completely stop spinning on its axis. I kept my face entirely rigid and emotionless, gripping my empty ceramic mug so incredibly tightly my knuckles turned pure white under the harsh fluorescent lights. I offered her a very polite, tight-lipped, professional nod, and turned my back to her, pretending to be completely disinterested in her sudden dominant presence. But Harper did not just grab a cold water bottle from the massive refrigerator and quickly leave the room. She walked very slowly toward me, her designer heels clicking in a slow, terrifying rhythm on the polished white tile floor. She leaned casually against the cold marble counter right next to me, deliberately crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She aggressively asked me who I was and what exactly I was doing roaming freely on the highly restricted executive floor. I kept my voice incredibly low, flat, and deeply monotonous, explicitly telling her I was Valerie, a senior independent compliance auditor temporarily hired by the primary venture capital firm from Chicago. Harper tilted her head slightly to the right, studying my rigid face with a terrifyingly intense and highly suspicious focus. The new thick-framed dark glasses and the severe blunt haircut drastically changed my overall physical appearance, but Harper had spent 3 entire years staring directly at me from across crowded corporate office rooms and lavish holiday party dinner tables. She inherently possessed a deeply cunning and uniquely hyper-observant nature that made her incredibly dangerous. She took another slow, deliberate step closer, completely invading my personal space and trapping me against the counter. The cloying, heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume filled my lungs, making my empty stomach churn with a violent, sickening disgust. She narrowed her icy blue eyes and told me in a low, chilling voice that there was something incredibly familiar about my underlying bone structure. She slowly reached out her perfectly manicured right hand as if she was actually going to brush a stray piece of dark dyed hair away from my pale cheek. I forced my entire body to remain completely perfectly still, actively fighting every single screaming primal survival urge to violently slap her hand away and run for the exit. My heart pounded so violently against my chest wall, I was absolutely certain she could physically hear it echoing loudly in the quiet, sterile room. Then she suddenly paused, her hand hovering just 2 inches from my sweating face. She took a very slow, deep, calculating breath through her nose. She commented casually but dangerously that my specific perfume smelled exactly like a very rare custom fragrance her husband's late wife used to import exclusively from a small boutique in Europe. The sheer terrifying accuracy of her sudden observation sent a massive freezing shockwave straight down my spine, paralyzing my lungs. In my rushed, chaotic morning preparation back at the apartment, I had completely mistakenly used the very last drops of my absolute favorite personal perfume from a tiny travel bottle hidden deep inside my old leather purse. It was a massive, catastrophic, fatal error. Harper's icy blue eyes grew incredibly wide, and a dark, highly calculating suspicion began to spread rapidly across her beautiful, heavily contoured face. She was literally mere seconds away from putting the impossible, horrific pieces together and fully realizing that the murdered, dead wife she helped kill was standing right in front of her, breathing her air. I desperately needed to aggressively derail her dangerous train of thought right this exact second before she loudly screamed for Julian or quickly called the heavily armed corporate security guards waiting in the lobby. I knew exactly what Harper valued more than absolutely anything else in the entire world. She deeply valued cold, hard, untraceable cash. I looked her directly and fearlessly in the eyes and completely dropped my submissive, quiet auditor persona. I let a very cold, highly arrogant, mocking smirk briefly touch the corners of my lips. I confidently told her I had absolutely no idea who the tragic late wife was, but I did know a whole lot about terribly drafted legal contracts. I casually mentioned that while I was meticulously reviewing the executive financial disclosures, sitting openly on Julian's massive mahogany desk earlier this morning, I accidentally saw the final unsealed draft of her brand new post-nuptial financial agreement. Harper completely and totally froze. The highly dangerous suspicion burning in her eyes instantly vanished entirely, replaced by a sudden massive flash of raw, panicked financial greed. I leaned in slightly closer to her, lowering my voice to a dark conspiratorial whisper. I told her that Julian's expensive corporate lawyers had intentionally and maliciously buried a highly toxic absolute forfeiture clause deep on page 42 of the thick legal document. I fabricated a brilliantly complex, highly realistic lie, carefully explaining that if his tech company ever faced federal bankruptcy or severe civil litigation, the hidden legal clause completely stripped her of any and all spousal equity and instantly transferred all her personal marital assets directly back to the primary venture capital investors to cover his massive corporate debts. I told her it was a very standard, highly predatory legal tactic actively used by wealthy, ruthless startup founders to fully protect their powerful corporate boards while intentionally leaving their naive new wives with absolutely nothing but massive legal fees. The psychological financial trap snapped shut with devastating absolute perfection. Harper's beautiful face turned completely pale, and her perfectly manicured hands instantly began to tremble with pure, genuine fury. The terrifying immediate threat of losing her stolen millions and returning to a life of poverty instantly blinded her to any lingering suspicious questions about my familiar bone structure or my rare custom perfume. She absolutely did not care about dead wives or familiar faces anymore. She only deeply cared about aggressively protecting her massive impending financial payday. She cursed loudly and violently under her breath, turning her absolute unchecked rage directly toward Julian and his entire legal team. She aggressively demanded to know exactly how the specific forfeiture clause was legally phrased. I simply shrugged my shoulders with a calm, cold professional indifference, clearly telling her I was just a visiting temporary auditor and she should probably go directly ask her dear husband why his own lawyers were secretly, actively plotting to leave her completely destitute and bankrupt. Harper absolutely did not ask me another single question about my identity. She spun around violently on her expensive designer heels and stormed furiously out of the executive break room, aggressively slamming the heavy frosted glass door shut behind her. I could clearly hear her screaming Julian name at the top of her lungs as she marched rapidly down the plush-carpeted hallway directly toward his private corner office. I finally let out a long, shaky, terrified breath, heavily gripping the edge of the cold marble counter to physically steady my violently trembling legs. The massive psychological distraction was absolutely perfectly executed. I walked swiftly and quietly back into the empty glass boardroom. The digital download progress bar on my laptop screen had just hit exactly 100%. I safely and quickly ejected my highly secure local flash drive and slid it deep inside the hidden pocket of my leather briefcase, locking it tight. Through the transparent glass walls, I could clearly see Harper shouting violently at Julian inside his private office, wildly waving her arms in pure rage while he desperately tried to physically calm her down and explain the non-existent legal document. I calmly packed my remaining audit papers smoothly, buttoned my dark gray suit jacket, and walked straight out of the corporate headquarters, carrying the exact devastating financial weapon I desperately needed to destroy them both completely and utterly. The cold autumn rain was pounding violently against the thick glass windows of Maya's secure apartment when I finally walked back through the front door. My entire body was physically shaking from the massive adrenaline crash, but my mind was operating with terrifying absolute clarity. I had successfully walked directly into the heavily guarded fortress of the man who tried to murder me, and I had walked out with his entire financial life securely locked inside my leather briefcase. Maya was pacing nervously across the living room floor, still wearing her dark navy suit from the district attorney office. When she saw the encrypted flash drive in my hand, she let out a long, heavy sigh of profound relief. I did not waste any time taking off my damp coat or changing my clothes. I walked straight to the kitchen island and plugged the small device directly into her highly secure government laptop. The screen instantly flickered to life, illuminating the dark room with a harsh pale light. I entered my complex decryption key and the stolen digital ledgers from Julian's primary workstation finally spilled open before my eyes. What I found inside those hidden files was infinitely more horrifying and vastly more complex than a simple life insurance payout. Julian was not just a greedy husband who murdered his wife to save his failing startup. He was actively operating a massive, sophisticated Ponzi scheme that would make federal prosecutors drool. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the endless rows of stolen financial data. I told Maya to come look at the screen, pointing my shaking finger at a specific series of massive wire transfers. I explained that Julian had indeed received the $5 million life insurance payout from my fake death, but he did not use that money to actually fix his bankrupt tech company. He used my blood money to fund his lavish personal lifestyle, to buy Harper expensive diamonds, and to secure the $1 million penthouse. To keep his tech startup completely afloat and aggressively push for his upcoming initial public offering, he was currently stealing tens of millions of dollars directly from his elite venture capital investors. He was actively falsifying his corporate revenue streams, creating fake client portfolios, and illegally moving massive amounts of investor capital into his own private offshore accounts. But the most terrifying detail was how he was paying to cover up my murder. I opened a hidden secondary ledger heavily encrypted under a fake vendor name. I traced a specific digital payment of $500,000. Julian did not pay the corrupt mechanic who cut my brake lines using his own personal money. He paid the mechanic using a diverted corporate seed fund specifically earmarked for software development. He literally used venture capital investment money to finance my brutal execution. Maya stared at the glowing screen, her dark eyes wide with absolute legal shock. She whispered that this was no longer just a simple domestic homicide case. It was a massive federal corporate fraud conspiracy involving international money laundering and wire fraud. She immediately reached for her encrypted phone, telling me she was calling her Federal Bureau of Investigation contacts right now to raid his corporate headquarters. But I reached out and firmly grabbed her wrist, stopping her completely. I looked deeply into her eyes and told her no. I explained that if we sent the federal agents in right now, Julian would simply use his massive stolen offshore wealth to immediately post bail. He would hire an army of the most expensive defense attorneys in the entire country. He would comfortably drag the legal proceedings out for a decade while actively destroying all the remaining evidence. He would never actually suffer the true agonizing pain he inflicted upon me. Sending him to a comfortable white-collar prison was absolutely not enough. I needed to completely destroy his entire empire from the inside out. I needed to suffocate him financially until he had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Maya slowly lowered her phone, her sharp legal mind fully grasping the terrifying magnitude of my cold strategy. She asked me exactly how I planned to take down a multi-million-dollar corporate empire without exposing my own identity. I turned my attention back to the glowing laptop screen, cracking my knuckles with a cold, dark satisfaction. I told her we were going to use the exact same financial systems he was manipulating to violently crush him. As a senior forensic accountant, I knew intimately how the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission tracked massive corporate fraud. Federal agencies do not rely on simple anonymous phone calls to launch massive corporate raids. They rely entirely on highly complex automated digital algorithms that constantly scan global financial markets for specific numerical anomalies. I did not need to physically call the authorities. I just needed to quietly plant the digital breadcrumbs that would force their automated systems to violently trip and instantly freeze all of his assets. I began typing rapidly on the keyboard, accessing the public corporate portals Julian used to file his mandatory financial disclosures. Because I had successfully planted the physical keystroke logger on his computer, I now had his master administrative passwords. I seamlessly logged into his primary corporate accounting software completely undetected. The trap required absolute mathematical precision. I could not simply delete massive amounts of money because his internal accounting team would notice the blunt error immediately. Instead, I systematically altered the specific routing codes on his international tax declarations. I changed a single digit on his corporate tax identification number linked to his largest offshore shell company. Then I intentionally mismatched the reported quarterly earnings against the liquid asset ratios he had just officially submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission for his upcoming initial public offering. I essentially created a massive glaring mathematical paradox within his own digital tax filings. To a human auditor, it might simply look like a careless clerical error, but to the ruthless automated federal algorithms, it looked exactly like massive international tax evasion and domestic securities fraud. Maya watched over my shoulder, completely fascinated by the silent digital warfare I was actively waging. She used her high-level encrypted prosecutor credentials to quietly route my digital modifications through a series of anonymous international servers, ensuring the changes could never be traced back to her apartment. We worked together in total perfect silence for 6 grueling hours. By the time the morning sun fully illuminated the Seattle skyline, the deadly digital tripwires were completely set. I had successfully turned Julian-owned stolen corporate data into a highly aggressive financial virus. All we had to do now was sit back and watch the federal automated systems execute the trap. I opened the live feed from the hidden keystroke logger I had planted in his office, securely monitoring his actual desktop computer screen in real time. We did not have to wait very long for the catastrophic damage to begin. Exactly at 9 o'clock in the morning, the automated federal banking systems began their daily sweeping audits. The massive mathematical anomalies I had carefully planted instantly triggered a severe Level 5 alert within the Internal Revenue Service Domestic Enforcement Division. Less than 10 minutes later, the Securities and Exchange Commission automated compliance system flagged Julian's entire corporate portfolio for immediate extreme review. Because the suspected financial fraud involved tens of millions of dollars in active venture capital, the federal algorithms completely bypassed human authorization and immediately executed standard asset protection protocols. They began aggressively freezing his entire financial life. I sat perfectly still on the metal bar stool, watching Julian's live computer screen actively mirror his absolute impending doom. He was logged into his primary corporate email account, cheerfully sending out lavish digital invitations for his upcoming initial public offering gala. Suddenly, a bright red notification popped up on his screen. It was an urgent automated email from his primary corporate bank in New York. The subject line read, "Account suspended pending federal review." I watched the live keystrokes as Julian quickly clicked the email, his cursor moving frantically across the screen. He immediately tried to log into his primary corporate banking portal to check his massive balances. The screen flashed a stark white error message, explicitly stating that his access was completely denied due to active federal holds. I could easily imagine the sudden cold terror gripping his chest. He immediately closed the banking window and opened his private offshore wealth management portal, desperately trying to access the millions of dollars he had stolen from my life insurance payout. He rapidly typed in his complex passwords, his digital keystrokes growing increasingly erratic and panicked. That account was also completely frozen by the international banking authorities due to the matching text identification anomalies I had planted. Maya let out a low, highly satisfied laugh, leaning against the kitchen counter. She pointed at the live screen as a new wave of absolute chaos erupted. Julian's personal cell phone must have started ringing because his digital desktop messaging application completely exploded with frantic, urgent messages from his executive board members. His chief financial officer sent a highly panicked message stating that the corporate payroll accounts were suddenly completely locked, and they could not pay their hundreds of employees. Another message popped up from his lead venture capital investor, angrily demanding to know why the Securities and Exchange Commission had just issued an emergency subpoena for their shared financial records. Julian was entirely trapped in a rapidly collapsing digital box, and he had absolutely no idea who was actually pulling the strings. I watched it with cold, calculating satisfaction as he desperately tried to use his elite black corporate credit card to hastily book a private international flight to the Cayman Islands. He navigated to an exclusive private aviation website, quickly entering his credit card numbers to secure an immediate escape route. The transaction processed for exactly 10 seconds before violently returning a massive red declined error. He furiously tried a different personal platinum card. It was also instantly declined. The massive federal dragnet had successfully snapped shut, completely cutting off his entire financial oxygen supply in less than 45 minutes. He had absolutely no access to his stolen millions. He had absolutely no access to his corporate funds. He was entirely paralyzed. But the absolute psychological torture was only just beginning. I wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating, helpless terror I felt when I woke up completely alone in that freezing mountain clinic. I wanted him to slowly realize that his entire perfect life was crumbling into dust before his eyes. I calmly opened a secure anonymous email portal using an untraceable encrypted network. I typed a very short, highly specific message and sent it directly to his private executive email address. The subject line was completely blank. The body of the email contained only one single sentence. I asked him if the brakes on his massive tech company were failing just like the brakes on my car. I watched his live computer screen as the anonymous email quietly arrived in his primary inbox. His digital mouse cursor slowly hovered over the bold, unread message. He clicked it open. For exactly 2 entire minutes, his mouse cursor did not move a single millimeter. He was staring blindly at the terrifying words, completely frozen in absolute pure horror. The arrogant, powerful tech chief executive officer was finally beginning to understand that the ghost of his murdered wife had violently returned from the grave, and she was currently holding the absolute complete power to destroy his entire world. He violently closed the email application, and I could clearly see the chaotic, frantic keystrokes as he desperately tried to run a full-system virus scan on his compromised machine. It was entirely useless. The physical hardware logger was completely undetectable by standard software. Maya looked at me, her expression a perfect mix of deep professional respect and chilling awe. She quietly said that he was going to completely lose his mind by the end of the day. I nodded slowly, taking a very deep, slow breath of the cool apartment air. I told her that losing his mind was only the very first step of his punishment. We had successfully frozen his massive stolen assets and completely terrified him. But Julian was an incredibly desperate, cornered animal, and desperate animals always make massive fatal mistakes when they are violently pushed to the absolute brink. I knew he would immediately try to find alternative illegal sources of untraceable cash to fund his escape. He would try to leverage the very last remaining piece of my hidden financial legacy. He would aggressively target Maya to access my protected trust fund. I turned to the brilliant prosecutor standing right beside me, fully preparing her for the dangerous psychological trap we were about to spring. The embezzlement web was completely exposed. The digital tripwires were violently triggered, and the brutal financial guillotine was slowly being raised directly over his arrogant head. The absolute destruction of Julian was proceeding exactly according to my flawless plan. The financial strangulation of my husband was complete, but Julian was exactly like a starving wolf backed into a dark corner. I knew from years of living with him that when his massive ego was threatened and his bank accounts were frozen, he would aggressively seek the path of least resistance to survive. He would completely ignore the massive complex federal algorithms tearing his company apart and desperately focus on finding immediate liquid cash to keep his fragile initial public offering alive. The only remaining untainted source of immense wealth in my entire portfolio was a highly protected legacy trust fund my late father had established for me years ago. It contained roughly $3 million in extremely stable municipal bonds. Julian had aggressively tried to access it numerous times during our marriage, but my father had been exceptionally paranoid. He specifically structured the ironclad legal trust so that if I suddenly passed away, the only person who could legally authorize the immediate liquidation and transfer of those specific funds to my surviving spouse was my designated legal executor. That designated executor was Maya. I sat across from Maya in her dimly lit apartment, monitoring the frozen bank accounts on my laptop. Her encrypted government phone began to vibrate violently on the glass coffee table. The caller identification flashed Julian's name in bright white letters. I looked at Maya and nodded slowly. The desperate animal had officially taken the bait. Maya cleared her throat, letting it ring 3 more times to establish dominance before calmly answering. She put the call on speakerphone so I could clearly hear his voice. Julian sounded completely frantic and entirely out of breath. He completely abandoned his usual smooth, arrogant cadence. He practically begged her to meet him immediately at an exclusive private dining club downtown, claiming he was dealing with an unprecedented, catastrophic corporate emergency that directly threatened my supposed financial legacy. He told her he desperately needed her help as his only remaining family. Maya played her part flawlessly. She injected the perfect amount of hesitant sibling concern into her voice, agreeing to meet him in exactly 1 hour. The moment she disconnected the call, we moved with strict military precision. I opened my black leather briefcase and pulled out a highly advanced microscopic audio transmitter. It was a completely undetectable law enforcement grade wire I had explicitly instructed Maya to borrow from her undercover narcotics division. I carefully threaded the tiny black wire through the thick fabric of her tailored silk blouse, securing the microscopic microphone perfectly flush against her diamond collarbone necklace. I handed her a small discreet earpiece so I could communicate directly with her during the tense negotiation. We tested the audio frequencies, ensuring I could hear every single pin drop in the room. I looked Maya deeply in the eyes, placing my hands firmly on her shoulders. I explicitly warned her that Julian was incredibly dangerous right now. He was a cornered predator who had already proven he was entirely capable of brutal murder. I told her to aggressively push his emotional buttons, but to immediately walk away if she felt physically threatened. Maya simply offered a cold, terrifyingly calm smile. She reminded me that she put violent cartel bosses in federal prison for a living, and her arrogant, cowardly brother absolutely did not scare her. I remained safely in her secure apartment, actively monitoring the live audio feed through my encrypted laptop while Maya drove to the upscale private dining club. The club was a pretentious, heavily guarded establishment entirely restricted to ultra-wealthy elite executives. Julian had intentionally rented out a private soundproof dining room in the back to ensure absolute secrecy. Through my digital headphones, I clearly heard the heavy oak door open and the distinct sound of Maya high heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Julian immediately launched into his desperate manipulative performance. He practically threw himself at her feet, crying fake tears and loudly lamenting how heavily the federal government was unfairly targeting his tech company. He aggressively spun a massive complex lie, claiming a massive clerical error at the Internal Revenue Service had temporarily frozen his accounts on the absolute eve of his multi-billion-dollar public offering. He swore to her that he just needed a short-term bridge loan to keep the corporate payroll afloat. Maya sat down slowly, ordering a glass of expensive red wine with absolute terrifying calm. I listened intently as she let him ramble and beg for 10 excruciating minutes. Then she finally stopped him. She coldly told him she knew exactly why he called her there. She stated flatly that he wanted her authorized signature to completely liquidate Victoria Protected Legacy Trust Fund. Julian eagerly confirmed it, his voice dripping with fake desperation. He claimed it was exactly what I would have wanted him to do to save the company we supposedly built together. He told her I would be absolutely devastated to see my beautiful corporate legacy destroyed by a simple bank error. I felt a massive wave of pure visceral disgust violently churn in my stomach at hearing him boldly use my memory to justify stealing my father's money. Maya took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. The ice clinking in her glass echoed sharply through my headphones. She leaned forward across the table. I instructed her softly, through the hidden earpiece, to start tightening the invisible noose. Maya stared directly into his eyes and told him she was heavily inclined to sign the legal authorization papers right now. I heard Julian let out a massive trembling sigh of profound relief, but Maya immediately cut his relief entirely short. She slammed her glass down on the table and aggressively shifted her tone from a supportive sister to a ruthless federal prosecutor. She told him there was one massive glaring problem preventing her from signing the documents. She told him she had secretly reviewed my official county autopsy report using her district attorney credentials. The private dining room went completely dead silent. For 20 agonizing seconds, the only sound transmitting through my audio feed was Julian's rapid, panicked breathing. Maya completely eliminated his escape routes. She coldly stated that the dental records submitted to the county morgue were absolutely pristine, but the actual teeth found in the burned vehicle were completely charred and fragmented. She aggressively demanded to know how the senior county medical examiner was able to legally issue a definitive death certificate so incredibly fast when standard forensic protocol absolutely required weeks of complex DNA testing for a fire that severe. She explicitly told him she would not sign over $3 million of my father's money until he looked her directly in the eyes and told her the absolute complete truth about what actually happened at that morgue. She brilliantly bluffed, telling him she suspected he had illegally paid the coroner to rush the paperwork just so he could aggressively claim the massive life insurance payout faster. Julian immediately exploded in a defensive panic. He vehemently denied everything, loudly insisting the medical examiner was simply doing a highly efficient job for a prominent, wealthy citizen. But Maya relentlessly pushed harder. She stood up from the table, aggressively grabbing her expensive leather purse. She told him he was a pathetic liar and she was leaving right now to legally block the trust fund permanently. She took exactly 3 loud steps toward the heavy oak door. The intense psychological pressure was absolutely magnificent. Julian completely broke under the immense weight of his own massive greed. He desperately lunged across the room, physically blocking the door. He begged her to wait, screaming that he would lose absolutely everything he owned if he did not get that money by tomorrow morning. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, holding my breath completely. Maya demanded the absolute truth one final time. Julian's voice violently cracked into a pathetic, trembling whisper. He finally admitted it. He told her he was heavily drowning in massive corporate debt, and the venture capitalists were aggressively preparing to completely destroy him. He confessed that when the tragic accident happened, he saw a desperate, chaotic opportunity to legally save his entire company. He explicitly admitted on the audio recording that he personally paid Dr. Richard Vance $400,000 in untraceable offshore funds to completely ignore the missing titanium dental crown and immediately signed a fraudulent death certificate without asking any difficult questions. He tried to frantically justify his horrific actions, claiming he only did it to honor my ambitious vision and actively protect the tech startup I loved so much. He swore to Maya that he never actually hurt me and that the fiery car crash was just a terrible, tragic accident he merely took financial advantage of. He was still fiercely lying about actively orchestrating my brutal murder and planting the fake body, but he had just legally confessed on a crystal-clear federal wiretap to massive international wire fraud and heavily bribing a senior government official to falsify a death certificate. It was the exact, absolute, undeniable proof we desperately needed to put him in a federal prison cell for the rest of his miserable life. I spoke softly into my microphone, telling Maya we had exactly what we needed, and to finish the meeting immediately. Maya looked at her pathetic, desperate brother with absolute, pure, unadulterated disgust. She pulled a shiny silver pen from her purse and aggressively snatched the legal authorization documents from his trembling hands. She rapidly signed her name on the bottom line of the massive contract, intentionally using the completely wrong legal signature to make the document entirely null and void when he desperately tried to cash it at the bank tomorrow. She shoved the useless papers hard into his chest and coldly told him she never wanted to see his face again. Maya stormed out of the private dining club, leaving Julian standing completely alone in the soundproof room, clutching a worthless piece of paper he foolishly thought would save his crumbling empire. When she walked back into the apartment 30 minutes later, she unbuttoned her silk blouse and carefully handed me the tiny black audio transmitter. We plugged it into the encrypted computer and safely extracted the massive audio file, heavily backing it up on multiple secure offline servers. I listened to his pathetic, desperate confession one more time, feeling a cold, dark wave of absolute triumph wash over my entire soul. Julian thought he had successfully manipulated his sister to secure his ultimate financial salvation. He had absolutely no idea. He had just actively handed the sharpest executioner's sword directly to his murdered wife. The heavy dominoes were now perfectly set in a highly lethal sequence. His corporate accounts were entirely frozen by the federal government. His new wife was violently suspicious of his hidden financial contracts. And I now legally possessed his crystal-clear audio confession to a massive federal crime. The only thing left to do was to force him out into the bright, unforgiving public light and violently burn his entire stolen world completely to the ground. The audio recording of Julian confessing to his massive crimes was safely secured, but a desperate man with nothing to lose is a highly unpredictable threat. We stayed up all night in my apartment monitoring the digital clone of his primary cell phone. Julian was violently pacing his penthouse floor, unable to sleep after Maya ripped up the legal trust documents. He was entirely broke and deeply terrified. But just before dawn, his secret encrypted messaging application lit up with a highly alarming notification from an unregistered number. I clicked open the digital message and read the horrifying words flashing brightly on my laptop screen. It was the mechanic. The corrupt grease monkey who had crawled underneath my sport utility vehicle and deliberately sliced my brake lines for a meager initial payout had been watching the financial news. He saw the massive headlines about Julian's upcoming multi-billion-dollar tech public offering and decided he wanted a much larger piece of the bloody pie. The mechanic sent a chilling message, explicitly demanding $500,000 in unmarked cash by midnight tonight. If Julian refused to pay the extortion money, he threatened to walk directly into the local police precinct and hand them the physical tools he used to murder the tech founder wife. I watched Julian live text responses frantically pop up on the screen. He was completely out of his mind with pure terror. His corporate bank accounts were completely frozen by the federal government, and his offshore funds were entirely locked down. He had absolutely no digital access to his stolen wealth, but Julian was a paranoid criminal who kept a massive emergency stash of physical cash hidden inside a biometric safe in his penthouse wall. He quickly texted the mechanic back, agreeing to the extortion demand and asking for a secure location for the drop. The mechanic sent back a specific set of coordinates located deep inside the desolate industrial shipping yards near the southern port of Seattle. But Julian was far too recognizable, and entirely too terrified to deliver the massive bag of cash himself. I hacked into the penthouse security cameras and watched live as he violently shook Harper awake. He aggressively shoved a heavy black duffel bag into her arms, screaming at her to deliver the money immediately, or they would both spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. Harper was sobbing uncontrollably, but Julian, absolute sheer panic, completely overpowered her. He was sending his new wife straight into a highly dangerous industrial wasteland in the dead of night. Maya and I did not hesitate for a single second. We grabbed our heavy coats and drove silently through the dark, rainy city streets, arriving at the massive shipping yards exactly 1 hour before the scheduled drop. The southern port was a terrifying labyrinth of towering, rusty cargo containers, giant steel cranes, and deep black shadows. The heavy smell of diesel fuel and salt water hung thickly in the freezing night air. Maya parked her dark sedan behind a massive stack of discarded shipping crates, offering us a perfect elevated vantage point over the empty intersection the mechanic had chosen. I rolled down the tinted window just a fraction of an inch, letting the cold wind bite my face. I absolutely did not want to reveal my physical identity to Harper tonight. If she saw my face right now, she would instantly run back to Julian, and their shared panic might cause them to flee the country before the federal authorities could officially indict them. I needed Harper to fail spectacularly, and I needed Julian paranoia to violently shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I asked Maya for the untraceable burner phone she kept in her tactical gear bag. She handed it to me with a sharp, knowing smile. Maya had spent a decade aggressively prosecuting organized crime in this exact city. She intimately knew the deeply violent gang territories that overlapped with these specific shipping yards. She quickly gave me the direct underground contact number for a ruthless local street enforcer, known for aggressively hijacking illicit drug shipments in this exact port sector. I punched the numbers into the cheap plastic keypad and waited for the harsh voice to answer. I completely disguised my voice, adopting a cold, detached tone. I rapidly gave the enforcer the exact coordinates of the impending meeting. I explicitly told him that a terrified blonde woman in a luxury vehicle was about to arrive carrying a black duffel bag containing exactly $500,000 in unmarked, untraceable bills. I told him there would be absolutely no armed security, and the money was completely free for the taking. The man on the phone did not ask a single question. He simply hung up the line. The violent trap was completely set. All we had to do now was sit back in the dark and watch the absolute chaos unfold right in front of our eyes. Exactly, at midnight, a sleek silver sports car slowly crept into the desolate industrial intersection. Its bright halogen headlights cutting through the thick coastal fog. The vehicle engine hummed loudly, echoing against the towering metal containers. The driver's side door opened, and Harper stepped out into the freezing rain. She looked completely pathetic and utterly terrified. She was wearing expensive designer sweatpants and a heavy raincoat, constantly looking over her shoulder with wide, panicked eyes. She dragged the heavy black duffel bag out of the passenger seat, her entire body physically shaking from the cold and the massive fear. A few moments later, a beat-up, rusty pickup truck aggressively pulled into the intersection, blocking her escape route. The mechanic stepped out of his truck. He was a massive, hulking man wearing a stained canvas jacket and holding a heavy steel wrench in his right hand. He walked slowly toward Harper, demanding she hand over the cash immediately. Harper was sobbing loudly, begging him to take the bag and just leave them alone forever. She held the massive bag out toward him, her hands trembling violently under the harsh yellow glow of a single flickering street lamp, illuminating the dark port. But the corrupt mechanic never got the chance to touch my stolen money. Before his thick fingers could graze the black nylon strap, the deafening roar of 3 highly modified motorcycles violently shattered the quiet night. The local street enforcers I had anonymously tipped off exploded from the dark alleyway between the towering cargo containers. They moved with terrifying speed and brutal efficiency. They completely surrounded Harper and the mechanic in a tight, aggressive circle, swinging heavy steel chains and shouting violent threats. The mechanic took one terrified look at the armed gang and immediately dropped his heavy wrench. He did not attempt to fight for the extortion money. He turned around and sprinted blindly into the dark maze of shipping containers, completely abandoning the blackmail plot to save his own life. Harper was left entirely alone, standing paralyzed in the center of the violent gang. One of the masked men aggressively snatched the heavy black duffel bag right out of her trembling hands, pushing her roughly backward onto the wet, cold asphalt. Harper completely collapsed onto the wet ground, screaming in pure terror. The masked men did not bother to look at her twice. They had exactly what they came for. They violently revved their motorcycle engines, spinning their tires on the wet pavement, and sped away into the dark night, disappearing completely with $500,000 of Julian's stolen cash. Harper stayed on the wet ground for 3 entire minutes, sobbing hysterically into her dirty hands. She had completely failed. She had lost the extortion money, and the mechanic was still out there as a massive lingering threat. She finally scrambled off the wet asphalt, blindly crawling back into her luxury sports car and locking the heavy doors. Through my digital wiretap, I could clearly hear her immediately call Julian. Her voice was a hysterical, shrieking mess. She screamed into the phone that a violent gang had just robbed her at gunpoint and stolen every single dollar he had given her. She told him the mechanic was gone and the massive bag of money was lost forever. I listened to Julian's reaction through my earpiece, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. He did not ask if his wife was safe. He did not ask if she was physically injured. He let out a loud, guttural scream of absolute pure madness. He started violently smashing things inside the $1 million penthouse. I heard heavy glass shattering against the walls and expensive furniture being aggressively overturned. He screamed that he was completely ruined. He was entirely out of money. His federal bank accounts were frozen, his massive trust fund gamble had violently failed, and now his absolute last physical safety net was entirely gone. The mechanic would definitely go to the police now because he did not get his massive payout. Julian paranoia finally hit its absolute breaking point. He was completely trapped in a suffocating web of his own making, surrounded by invisible enemies he could not even begin to comprehend. Maya and I watched silently from the dark shadows as Harper, completely terrified and entirely broken, sped away from the shipping yards. The brutal financial and psychological execution of my husband was nearly complete. He had absolutely nothing left to fight with and absolutely nowhere left to hide. The grand public finale was finally ready to begin. The grand ballroom of the massive downtown Seattle luxury hotel was a blinding sea of crystal chandeliers and pure, unadulterated corporate greed. It was the night of Julian's highly anticipated initial public offering gala. Hundreds of the wealthiest venture capitalists and elite tech investors in the city were gathered together, drinking expensive imported champagne and excitedly discussing the massive financial windfalls they fully expected to reap by midnight. The entire opulent setting was a perfect glittering illusion, actively masking a dark, raw, rotting core. Julian had spent the last 24 hours living in a state of absolute pure terror after his extortion money was violently stolen at the shipping yards, and his corporate bank accounts were completely frozen by the federal government. But tonight, he was desperately trying to play the role of the triumphant, visionary billionaire. I stood silently in the deep shadows of the elevated VIP balcony, looking down at the massive crowded floor. I was wearing the exact same stunning designer red dress I wore the very night he proposed to me 5 years ago. My dark, blunt wig was gone, and my natural hair fell softly around my shoulders. The ghost of Victoria Sterling had officially arrived at the execution. Down on the main floor, Julian was frantically moving through the massive crowd, actively shaking hands and loudly offering his trademark charismatic smile to everyone he passed. He was wearing a brand new custom-tailored black tuxedo, but from my elevated vantage point, I could clearly see the deep, terrifying cracks in his perfect, polished facade. His dark eyes were constantly darting around the room looking for invisible threats. His skin was pale and covered in a thin layer of cold, nervous sweat. He tightly gripped a crystal flute of champagne, his knuckles completely white from the massive physical strain. Right beside him stood Harper. She was wearing a heavy, glittering gold evening gown, trying desperately to project the image of a proud, supportive wife, but she looked entirely broken. The violent, traumatic robbery at the dark shipping yards had completely shattered her arrogant confidence. Every single time a waiter dropped a metal tray or a loud burst of laughter erupted from a nearby table, she violently flinched, gripping Julian's arm in pure terrified panic. They were two-cornered, desperate animals pretending to be royalty while actively standing on a massive, fragile trapdoor. Julian firmly believed that if he could just successfully ring the ceremonial bell tonight and officially launch the public trading of his tech startup, the massive sudden influx of billions of investor dollars would somehow miraculously save him. He naively thought the federal banking algorithms would eventually clear, and he could quietly replace the stolen venture capital before anyone actually noticed the massive missing funds. He was raising his crystal glass to the wealthy men in the room, completely oblivious to the cold, hard reality closing in entirely around him. He had absolutely no idea that the silent ticking clock, counting down his final moments of freedom, was about to hit absolute zero. While Julian was busy toasting to his fake brilliant future, Maya was silently orchestrating his ultimate destruction right outside the heavy glass doors of the luxury hotel. Through my hidden secure earpiece, I could clearly hear the steady, cold tactical commands of the federal raid being actively positioned. Maya had bypassed local law enforcement entirely and brought the heavy artillery. She was currently standing in the freezing autumn rain, leading a massive joint task force of heavily armed securities and Exchange Commission enforcement agents and Federal Bureau of Investigation tactical units. They did not arrive with loud blaring sirens or flashing red lights. They arrived in a long line of unmarked black tactical vehicles, completely cutting off every single exit point of the massive building. I listened to Maya's low, strict voice over the secure radio feed, explicitly directing her federal agents to quietly lock down the underground parking garage, the main lobby doors, and the busy kitchen service elevators. She was methodically sealing the massive concrete tomb, ensuring her arrogant brother had absolutely no physical avenue of escape. The extreme contrast between the loud, joyful celebration inside the bright ballroom and the dark, silent military precision happening right out on the wet city streets was absolutely intoxicating. The wealthy investors down below were happily eating expensive caviar and loudly comparing their luxury sports cars, completely unaware that the heavy federal net was aggressively tightening around the entire building. The tension in my own chest was incredibly thick and heavy, making it slightly difficult to breathe, but I refused to look away. I watched Julian glance nervously at his expensive gold watch. It was almost time for his grand keynote speech. He placed his empty champagne glass on a passing silver tray and aggressively pulled Harper toward the front of the massive room, where a brightly lit stage had been constructed just for him. He was completely desperate to get this final performance over with so he could officially claim his stolen billionaire status. I stepped slowly out of the deep shadows of the VIP balcony, moving closer to the thick glass railing. My heart beat in a slow, steady, rhythmic drum inside my ears. I reached into my small black evening clutch and pulled out the heavy encrypted flash drive containing his crystal-clear audio confession and the undeniable digital proof of his massive international money laundering. I held the cold metal device tightly in my palm, feeling the absolute raw power of pure, flawless justice coursing through my veins. The initial public offering gala was the exact perfect public venue for his brutal execution. Julian had always aggressively craved the bright spotlight. He had murdered me solely to protect his public image and secure his massive corporate wealth. Therefore, it was only fair that he lost absolutely everything he owned while standing perfectly illuminated in front of the exact same elite society he had brutally sacrificed me to impress. The heavy ballroom doors suddenly locked with a loud echoing click, controlled remotely by my tactical team outside. The massive trap was now completely sealed shut. Julian proudly adjusted his black bow tie and began to walk up the short wooden steps to the brightly lit stage, raising both of his hands to accept the thunderous applause of the doomed room. The ghost was finally ready to speak. The heavy applause echoed like rolling thunder through the grand ballroom of the massive downtown Seattle luxury hotel. The entire space was a blinding sea of crystal chandeliers, opulent floral arrangements, and pure, unadulterated corporate greed. It was the night of Julian's highly anticipated initial public offering gala. Hundreds of the wealthiest venture capitalists and elite tech investors in the city were gathered together, drinking expensive imported champagne and excitedly discussing the massive financial windfalls they fully expected to reap by midnight. The entire lavish setting was a perfect glittering illusion, actively masking a dark, rotting core. Julian had spent the last 24 hours living in a state of absolute pure terror after his extortion money was violently stolen at the shipping yards and his corporate bank accounts were completely frozen by the federal government. But tonight, he was desperately trying to play the role of the triumphant visionary billionaire. He firmly believed that if he could just successfully ring the ceremonial bell tonight and officially launch the public trading of his tech startup, the massive sudden influx of billions of investor dollars would somehow miraculously save him. He naively thought the federal banking algorithms would eventually clear and he could quietly replace the stolen venture capital before anyone actually noticed the massive missing funds. I stood perfectly still in the deep shadows of the elevated VIP balcony, looking directly down at the massive crowded floor. I was wearing the exact same stunning designer red dress I wore the very night he proposed to me 5 years ago. My dark, blunt disguise wig was completely gone, and my natural hair fell softly around my bare shoulders. The ghost of Victoria Sterling had officially arrived at the execution. Down on the main floor, Julian was frantically moving through the massive crowd, actively shaking hands and loudly offering his trademark charismatic smile to everyone he passed. He was wearing a brand new custom-tailored black tuxedo, but from my elevated vantage point, I could clearly see the deep, terrifying cracks in his perfect polished facade. His dark eyes were constantly darting around the room, looking for invisible threats. His skin was pale and covered in a thin layer of cold, nervous sweat. Right beside him stood Harper. She was wearing a heavy, glittering gold evening gown, trying desperately to project the image of a proud, supportive wife. But she looked entirely broken. The violent, traumatic robbery at the dark industrial port had completely shattered her arrogant confidence. Every single time a waiter dropped a metal tray or a loud burst of laughter erupted from a nearby table, she violently flinched, gripping Julian's arm in pure, terrified panic. They were two cornered, desperate animals pretending to be royalty while actively standing on a massive, fragile trapdoor. What Julian did not know was that the luxury hotel was already a sealed concrete tomb. Maya had bypassed local law enforcement entirely and brought the heavy federal artillery. She was currently standing in the freezing autumn rain outside, leading a massive joint task force of heavily armed securities and Exchange Commission enforcement agents and Federal Bureau of Investigation tactical units. They had silently locked down the underground parking garage, the main lobby doors, and the busy kitchen service elevators, ensuring Julian had absolutely no physical avenue of escape. Maya technical team had also successfully hacked into the primary audio-visual network of the hotel ballroom, giving me absolute complete control over the massive LED screens and the entire surround sound speaker system from the small digital tablet in my hand. Julian proudly adjusted his black bow tie and began to walk up the short wooden steps to the brightly lit main stage. He walked directly to the center, where a large polished brass bell was prominently mounted on a thick wooden podium. He grabbed the microphone with a wide practiced smile, waving graciously to the cheering crowd. He cleared his throat and raised his hand, signaling for the massive crowd to quiet down. The room fell into a respectful, hushed silence. He began his carefully rehearsed keynote speech, speaking smoothly about innovation and the relentless pursuit of technological excellence. He thanked his elite board of directors and the wealthy venture capitalists who had blindly handed him tens of millions of dollars. But then his voice intentionally dropped to a soft, mournful whisper. He looked down at the polished floor, acting as if he was suddenly overwhelmed by a deep, profound grief. He told the silent crowd that he only wished one specific person could be here tonight to witness this massive triumph. He took a slow, dramatic breath and boldly invoked my name. He spoke about his late beloved wife, Victoria. He lied through his teeth, telling the audience how I was the true, pure inspiration behind his entire company. He claimed my tragic, sudden death in those mountains had completely broken his heart, but simultaneously given him the profound strength to finish building his empire in my honor. The sheer audacity of his performance made my stomach violently churn with pure acidic disgust. Several wealthy women in the front row actually wiped genuine tears from their eyes, completely captivated by the tragic, beautiful story of the grieving widower. He raised his hand toward the heavy brass bell, proudly declaring that he was ringing it tonight, not just for the future of technology, but for the eternal loving memory of Victoria. Julian reached out and firmly grabbed the thick rope attached to the ceremonial bell. He pulled it hard. The loud, sharp chime echoed through the massive ballroom, signaling his supposed victory. The audience erupted into a massive standing ovation, but the applause only lasted for exactly 4 seconds. I pressed the primary execution command on my glowing tablet. Directly behind Julian, the massive towering LED screens that proudly displayed his sleek corporate logo suddenly glitched with a loud, harsh static sound. The bright white logo violently distorted and then completely vanished into absolute blackness. The crowd slowly stopped clapping, murmuring in soft confusion. Julian turned around, his polished smile faltering slightly as he stared at the blank screens. He tapped his microphone quickly, attempting to make a charming joke about the hotel technical difficulties. But the screens did not stay black. They violently flared back to life, illuminating the entire grand ballroom in a harsh neon green light. The massive screens were no longer displaying a corporate logo. They were actively mirroring the exact stolen offshore banking ledgers I had downloaded from his private computer. The massive high-definition displays clearly showed his hidden international accounts, the highly illegal shell company names in the Cayman Islands, and the exact specific dollar amounts he had systematically embezzled directly from the elite venture capital investors sitting right there in the audience. The room fell into a deadly, suffocating silence. The wealthiest men in Seattle stared up at the massive screens, their eyes growing wide with absolute shock, as they clearly saw their own proprietary investment funds being illegally routed into Julian private offshore accounts. Julian dropped his arm, his face turning the color of dead chalk. He frantically yelled at the audiovisual booth in the back of the room, demanding they shut the main screens off immediately. But the hotel technicians were already detained by federal agents in the hallway. The screens were permanently locked, and the visual evidence was only the first part of the brutal execution. I tapped the secondary command on my tablet. The massive surround sound speakers hanging from the high ceiling suddenly cracked to life. The hidden audio recording we captured at the private dining club began to play at maximum volume, completely drowning out Julian, panicked, shouting. His own desperate, frantic voice echoed violently off the crystal chandeliers. The entire room listened in sheer horrified silence as the recorded Julian explicitly confessed to heavily drowning in massive corporate debt. The investors gasped loudly as they heard him admit to actively stealing their money to save his own life. But the absolute fatal blow came seconds later. The clear, undeniable sound of Maya asking about the fake dental records echoed through the room, followed immediately by Julian's sobbing confession. The crowd heard him explicitly admit that he personally paid the county medical examiner, Dr. Richard Vance, $400,000 in untraceable offshore funds to completely ignore the missing titanium crown and illegally sign the fraudulent death certificate without asking any difficult questions. He admitted to using a fake burned body to claim the $5 million life insurance payout. The grand ballroom instantly erupted into absolute catastrophic chaos. The elite venture capitalists, who had just been clapping for him, suddenly surged forward, screaming violently in pure, unadulterated financial rage. They realized they had not just been robbed, they had been actively funding a massive premeditated murder cover-up. Several older investors had to be physically restrained by their personal security details to stop them from rushing the stage. Harper stood completely frozen in the front row, her face a mask of absolute pure horror, as the angry crowd aggressively turned on her husband. Julian stumbled backward away from the podium, his breathing erratic and shallow. He looked exactly like a man who had just watched his own executioner aggressively sharpen the heavy blade. He covered his ears desperately, trying to block out the sound of his own damning confession playing on a continuous violent loop. The pristine, opulent gala had been entirely transformed into a brutal, public slaughterhouse in less than 60 seconds. He had absolutely nowhere to run and absolutely no one left to manipulate. Suddenly, every single light in the massive ballroom violently snapped off, plunging the screaming, chaotic crowd into complete, total darkness. The panic escalated for 3 seconds before a single blinding white spotlight cut sharply through the heavy black air. The bright beam of light did not illuminate the main stage. It violently swept upward, directly illuminating the elevated VIP balcony directly above the chaotic crowd. I stepped slowly out of the deep shadows and walked right into the center of the blinding spotlight. The entire room went completely dead silent. Hundreds of faces turned upward, staring in absolute terrified disbelief. My posture was completely straight, my gaze as cold and sharp as a butcher knife. Julian slowly looked up, his dark eyes locking onto mine from the stage below. His jaw physically dropped and his knees buckled violently, as if all the remaining strength had been instantly drained from his bones. He was staring directly at the woman he had murdered, standing gloriously alive, bathed in pure bright light. I brought the wireless microphone slowly to my lips. My voice echoed loudly and clearly through the massive silent room, dripping with pure terrifying ice and absolute undeniable power. "Hello, darling," I said smoothly, the sound slicing completely through his shattered reality. "I heard you sold my house. I have come to collect the rent." The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was heavy enough to crush bone. The single blinding white spotlight pinned me against the dark velvet curtains of the elevated balcony. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had ordered my brutal execution. Julian was frozen on the main stage, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. For several agonizing seconds, his brain simply refused to process the impossible reality standing right in front of him. He had personally watched a charred casket go into the cold earth. He had paid a massive fortune in stolen money to ensure I was permanently erased from the world. Now his murdered wife was staring right back at him, wearing the exact same designer red dress he had once claimed to love. The heavy crystal champagne glass slipped completely from his sweating fingers. It hit the polished wooden stage and shattered into 100 sparkling pieces. The sharp, loud sound of the breaking glass violently snapped his fragile mind completely in half. Julian completely lost his mind, his handsome face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure primal desperation. He grabbed the microphone from the wooden podium, his knuckles turning completely white. He pointed a violently shaking finger up at the balcony. "That is an imposter!" he screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched shriek. "That is not my wife. Victoria is dead. I buried her. This is a sick, twisted setup orchestrated by my corporate rivals to completely ruin my public offering. Turn off that spotlight right now and arrest that woman." He was frantically waving his free arm, commanding the silent room to believe his chaotic, desperate lies. He desperately wanted the wealthy investors to look away from the massive, glowing screens projecting his absolute guilt and focus their anger on the supposed fake woman on the balcony. But absolutely nobody in the massive crowd moved a single inch. The elite venture capitalists and wealthy board members were not stupid. They were ruthless, highly calculating businessmen who had just heard a crystal-clear audio recording of Julian explicitly confessing to bribing a senior medical examiner to cover up a murder. They looked from the terrified, shrieking man on the stage to the calm, poised woman standing in the light, and they instantly knew the horrifying truth. Julian realized his desperate lies were completely failing. The room was turning aggressively against him. The wealthy men who had been happily shaking his hand just 5 minutes ago were now actively stepping backward, physically distancing themselves from a confirmed monster. His breathing became incredibly rapid and shallow, echoing loudly through his live microphone. He looked wildly around the grand ballroom, desperately searching for any friendly face, any ally who would blindly support his crumbling empire. He aggressively turned to his right, expecting to find his loyal new wife standing firmly by his side. But the space right next to him was completely empty. Harper had already made her choice. She was a highly opportunistic survivor who deeply valued her own freedom far more than any fake marriage vows. The very second she heard Julian's audio confession play over the massive speakers, she knew the entire fraudulent operation was catastrophically over. She did not hesitate to completely abandon the sinking ship. While Julian was frantically screaming at the balcony, Harper had quietly dropped her expensive evening clutch onto the floor. She slowly backed away from the brightly lit stage, keeping her head down and blending into the chaotic shadows of the terrified crowd. I watched from my elevated vantage point as the glittering gold fabric of her heavy evening gown moved swiftly toward the rear kitchen service doors. She was desperately trying to slip out the back exit and disappear into the rainy city night, leaving her wealthy husband to completely face the federal firing squad alone. There was absolutely no honor among greedy thieves, but Maya had already anticipated the cowardice of the new wife. Just as Harper pushed her manicured hands against the heavy swinging wooden doors of the kitchen, two massive federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers stepped firmly out of the shadows. They grabbed her aggressively by the arms, entirely ignoring her loud, hysterical sobbing. They slammed heavy steel handcuffs onto her delicate wrists, reading her strict legal rights as they dragged her completely out of the ballroom. Julian watched his new wife violently hauled away, and the absolute last thread of his sanity finally snapped. He let out a loud guttural roar of pure animalistic rage. He threw the heavy microphone forcefully onto the wooden floor, producing a massive screeching feedback loop that made the entire crowd cover their ears in pain. He had absolutely no money left. He had no company left. He had no wife left. The only thing he had left in his entire pathetic world was his blinding, violent hatred for the woman who had just successfully destroyed his life. He locked his dark, furious eyes onto me and charged. He leaped aggressively off the front of the main stage, entirely ignoring the short wooden steps. He violently shoved a wealthy elderly investor out of his way, sending the old man crashing hard into a table of champagne flutes. Julian sprinted directly toward the grand marble staircase that led up to my VIP balcony. His face was bright red and his teeth were bared in a terrifying snarl. He was coming to wrap his sweating hands around my throat and finish the brutal job the corrupt mechanic had completely failed to do. I did not flinch. I did not step backward into the shadows. I did not even blink. I stood perfectly still at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the charging, desperate rat with absolute cold detachment. I knew he would never even make it halfway up those steps. Before Julian Foot could even touch the very first marble stair, the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom violently exploded open. A massive flood of heavily armed federal agents poured aggressively into the opulent room. At the absolute front of the tactical formation was Maya. She was no longer playing the role of the concerned, hesitant sister. She was a furious, ruthless assistant district attorney who was finally executing the absolute perfect takedown of the man she despised. She marched aggressively across the polished floor, flashing her gold legal badge high in the air. Julian barely had time to turn his head toward the massive commotion before three large Federal Bureau of Investigation agents violently tackled him from the side. The physical impact was incredibly brutal. They hit him with the combined force of a speeding freight train, completely lifting his feet off the ground and slamming his body forcefully down onto the hard, polished marble floor. The heavy breath was instantly knocked out of his lungs in a loud, sickening wheeze. His expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo ripped loudly at the shoulder as the highly trained agents aggressively pinned his arms firmly behind his back. Julian thrashed violently against the hard floor, kicking his legs and screaming wildly like a trapped feral animal. But he was completely powerless against the heavy federal force. The sharp, cold click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed loudly over the chaotic shouting of the massive crowd. Maya stood directly over his pinned body, staring down at him with absolute pure disgust. She leaned down close to his bleeding face, strictly informing him that he was under federal arrest for massive corporate wire fraud, international money laundering, and the premeditated attempted murder of Victoria Sterling. The violent, chaotic struggle on the floor was completely over in less than 30 seconds. Julian was completely neutralized, absolutely defeated, and permanently trapped. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the incredibly heavy weight of the last 3 terrifying months completely lift off my tired shoulders. It was finally time for the ghost to officially return to the living world. I reached out and gently gripped the smooth wooden handrail of the grand marble staircase. I began my slow, deliberate descent. I did not rush. I did not run. Every single step I took was a powerful, calculated statement of absolute supreme victory. The sharp clicking sound of my designer heels striking the hard marble stairs completely cut through the remaining ambient noise in the massive room. The blinding white spotlight slowly followed my every single movement, ensuring that absolutely everyone in the grand ballroom was forced to watch the resurrected queen formally reclaim her stolen throne. As I reached the bottom of the grand staircase, the massive crowd of wealthy elite investors completely parted for me exactly like the Red Sea. They physically stepped backward, bumping into each other to clear a wide-open path. Their faces were a complex mixture of absolute profound shock, deep financial terror, and overwhelming awe. These were the exact same powerful men who had happily written Julian massive, multi-million-dollar checks just yesterday. Now they were looking at me with the deep, intense respect reserved only for apex predators. I walked slowly and purposefully through the exact center of the parted crowd. I completely ignored the desperate wealthy men violently whispering my name. I kept my posture rigidly straight and my expression completely unreadable. I was projecting absolute pure boss energy, radiating a cold, terrifying power that commanded total silence. I walked directly toward the very front row of the audience, where a specific older gentleman with thick silver hair was standing entirely frozen in shock. I recognized him immediately. He was the senior regional director of the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission. He had been personally invited by Julian tonight to legitimize the massive public offering gala. Now he was standing in the middle of the largest active corporate crime scene in modern history. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely unsure if he was staring at a living, breathing woman or a highly complex corporate illusion. I did not smile. I did not offer a polite, warm greeting. I simply opened my small black evening clutch and pulled out the heavy encrypted flash drive. I held the small metal device out toward the senior federal director. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of any trembling emotion. I clearly stated that the digital drive contained the complete, unedited offshore banking ledgers, the highly encrypted shell company routing numbers, and the exact localized keystroke data, explicitly proving Julian had actively embezzled over $40 million of domestic venture capital. I told him it also contained the pristine digital audio files of Julian explicitly confessing to bribing the senior county medical examiner to falsify my death certificate. The older man slowly reached out with a violently shaking hand and carefully took the cold metal drive from my palm. He clutched it tightly against his chest, nodding his head rapidly in silent, profound understanding. He knew he was holding the absolute fatal bullet that would put my husband in a dark federal prison cell for the rest of his natural life. With the massive physical evidence officially transferred into federal custody, I slowly turned my body to completely face the man writhing on the hard floor. Julian was currently being roughly dragged to his knees by 2 large federal agents. His perfect custom tuxedo was torn and heavily covered in white dust. His expensive silk bow tie was completely crooked. A thin stream of dark red blood trickled slowly from a fresh cut on his forehead, where he had violently hit the marble stairs. He looked absolutely pathetic. He looked incredibly small. He looked exactly like the weak, cowardly parasite he had always truly been underneath the expensive suits and the loud, arrogant words. He stared up at me, his chest heaving violently, his dark eyes completely filled with hot tears of pure, ultimate defeat. "Victoria," he sobbed loudly, his voice a wet, pathetic whimper that echoed through the silent room. "Please, listen to me." I was completely desperate. The massive debt was entirely crushing me. "I never wanted to actually hurt you. I loved you. We can fix this. Please tell them to let me go. I will give you everything back. I will give you the entire company." I stood towering directly over him, looking down into his crying, pathetic face. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a single drop of lingering love. I only felt the clean, cold, absolute satisfaction of a master architect watching her perfectly designed trap violently snap completely shut. I looked around the room at the hundreds of wealthy investors actively backing away from him in pure visceral disgust. They were looking at him exactly like he was a piece of rotting trash, actively contaminating their pristine ballroom. I turned my cold gaze back down to Julian. I did not yell at him. I did not scream. I spoke in a voice so incredibly quiet and deadly calm that it carried far more terrifying power than any loud shout ever could. "You cannot give me anything back, Julian," I whispered coldly, making sure he heard every single harsh word. "You do not own this tech company. You do not own the luxury penthouse. You do not even own the cheap, ripped suit on your back. You are completely bankrupt. Your new wife happily abandoned you the very second the money disappeared. And you are going to spend the absolute rest of your miserable life rotting in a tiny concrete cell where your arrogant silver tongue cannot save you." I slowly crouched down so my face was perfectly level with his crying eyes. I smiled a very sharp, highly dangerous smile. You tried to bury me in the dark completely, forgetting that I was the exact person who built your entire world. Enjoy federal prison, darling. I hear their accounting department is absolutely terrible. I stood back up smoothly, turning my back on him entirely. I did not look back as the heavy federal agents forcefully hauled his screaming, sobbing body up from the floor and dragged him aggressively toward the heavy ballroom doors. His pathetic cries for mercy faded slowly into the long echo of the hotel corridor, completely silenced by the heavy click of the metal doors shutting tight. The execution was absolutely flawless. The cornered rat was permanently caged, and the ghost was finally ready to start living again. The cold fluorescent lights of the federal interrogation room buzzed with a low, constant mechanical hum that irritated the senses. Julian sat handcuffed to a heavy steel ring, bolted directly into the center of the solid metal table. It had been exactly 3 hours since the armed federal agents dragged him violently out of his opulent public gala. The torn, expensive fabric of his custom black tuxedo was heavily stained with white dust and dried blood from where his face had violently hit the hard marble floor. But despite his incredibly pathetic physical appearance, his massive toxic ego was slowly beginning to reassemble itself in the quiet isolation. Through the two-way mirror in the adjacent observation room, Maya and I watched him closely. He was actively running his mouth to a completely silent federal agent, aggressively demanding his one phone call and loudly threatening to sue the entire government for a massive civil rights violation. Julian had somehow convinced his shattered mind that because I was currently alive and breathing, the federal authorities had absolutely no actual murder case against him. He arrogantly believed that the horrific audio confession played over the speakers at the gala was merely proof of a desperate financial crime. He genuinely thought he was only facing a few short years in a highly comfortable, minimum security, white-collar prison for corporate wire fraud and bribing a local medical examiner. He truly believed the absolute worst part of his nightmare was over, and he could simply buy his way out with expensive lawyers. He was so incredibly wrong. The true nightmare was just about to begin. Maya pushed the heavy metal door open. The loud metallic squeal echoed sharply inside the small concrete room, making Julian jump. We walked in side by side, completely ignoring the armed federal agent, who quietly stepped outside and securely locked the heavy steel door behind us. Julian's head snapped up quickly. The arrogant, confident smirk on his bruised face instantly vanished the very second his dark eyes locked onto me. Being completely humiliated by me from a distant, brightly lit balcony in front of his wealthy investors was one thing. Having the murdered wife he had actively betrayed, standing less than 3 feet away from him in a locked concrete box, was entirely different. His eyes darted nervously between me and his adopted sister. He awkwardly cleared his throat, trying desperately to project a calm, collected executive facade. He leaned forward aggressively, testing the tight slack of his heavy steel handcuffs. He actually had the absolute sheer audacity to smile warmly at me. He softly told me he was genuinely thrilled that I was miraculously alive and well. He shamelessly claimed the massive financial fraud was just a desperate, terrible mistake made under extreme corporate pressure, but he swore on his life he never actually intended for the corrupt mechanic to kill me. He tried to spin a pathetic, desperate narrative, claiming he only wanted to severely damage my car to scare me into a quick, quiet divorce, and the mechanic simply went entirely rogue. He confidently turned his attention to Maya, explicitly telling her that since there was absolutely no actual murder victim, the premeditated homicide charges would instantly be dropped by any competent federal judge in the entire country. Maya pulled out a heavy metal chair and sat down directly across from him. She placed her dark leather prosecutor briefcase on the cold table with a loud authoritative thud that made him flinch. She looked at her arrogant brother with a level of cold, absolute disgust that could instantly freeze boiling water. She explicitly told him that his expensive corporate defense lawyers were absolutely not going to save him this time. She casually reminded him that he was on a crystal-clear federal audio wiretap, explicitly admitting to paying a corrupt medical examiner $400,000 in stolen offshore funds to completely fake a death certificate. Julian rolled his eyes, arrogantly leaning back in his metal chair as far as the heavy cuffs would physically allow. He scoffed loudly, telling her that secretly bribing a corrupt public official was just a simple Class B felony, and he would gladly take a standard plea deal for the financial crimes. He confidently reiterated his legal theory, stating that the government absolutely cannot charge a man with capital murder if the supposed dead victim is standing right inside the police station breathing the air. I stepped completely out of the dark shadow near the door and walked slowly toward the edge of the cold metal table. I placed both of my bare hands flat on the polished steel surface, leaning down so my face was entirely level with his bleeding forehead. I kept my voice incredibly soft and dangerously quiet. I told him he was absolutely right about one specific legal detail. I told him the state of Washington absolutely could not prosecute him for the violent murder of Victoria Sterling because Victoria Sterling was currently standing over him. Julian let out a short, arrogant breath of relief, foolishly thinking he had legally outsmarted us both. But I did not pull away. I stared directly into the dark, empty void of his eyes. I asked him the one terrifying, horrific question that had completely consumed my analytical mind since the exact moment I saw the county autopsy file. I asked him exactly who was the person burning inside my car. Julian's entire body violently flinched. The arrogant, confident smirk was completely wiped from his bruised face, instantly replaced by a sudden, massive, horrific realization. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously in his throat as his breathing suddenly became extremely shallow. He quickly averted his eyes, staring blindly at the blank grey concrete wall. He stammered frantically, claiming he had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. He aggressively lied, saying the corrupt mechanic must have just found a random, unidentified dead body from a local city morgue to completely fool the insurance company adjusters. But Maya did not let him hide safely behind his pathetic, frantic lies. She snapped the heavy brass latches of her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red federal file folder. She tossed it aggressively onto the exact center of the metal table directly in front of his handcuffed wrists. She explicitly told him that the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not ever rely on fake dental records or corrupt Mexican medical examiners. She told him they relied entirely on absolute, undeniable biological science. I opened the red folder and pulled out a highly detailed forensic laboratory document. It was a completely expedited federal DNA profile, legally authorized by Maya, the very second we originally realized the dental records were entirely forged. I placed the bright white paper directly under the harsh fluorescent ceiling light, so Julian was forcefully compelled to read the bold black text. I calmly explained to him that when the federal authorities secretly exhumed the heavy wooden casket from my fake grave yesterday morning, they successfully extracted intact bone marrow directly from the heavily charred remains. They ran the specific genetic markers completely through the National Missing Persons database. I watched the remaining blood completely drain from Julian's face, leaving his skin the color of dirty, wet ash. I pointed my finger directly at the confirmed victim name printed clearly on the federal report. I told him the burned body absolutely did not belong to a random stolen corpse. The body belonged to a 20-year-old runaway girl named Mia. I let the name hang heavily in the cold, sterile air of the interrogation room. Julian began to physically shake his heavy steel handcuffs, rattling loudly and violently against the metal table ring. I leaned in even closer, ensuring he felt the absolute full crushing weight of his monstrous crimes. I explicitly reminded him that his brand new greedy wife Harper had a deeply estranged younger sister. I told him that Mia had tragically struggled with severe substance abuse and had been living entirely off the grid on the dark, dangerous streets of Seattle for the past 2 long years. Harper had always viewed her younger sister as a massive, humiliating liability to her ambitious social climbing and wealthy new lifestyle. The horrifying, flawless truth of their dark conspiracy finally spilled completely into the open light. I methodically laid out the exact timeline of their brutal, premeditated execution. I told Julian that when he and Harper aggressively planned to murder me and completely steal my massive corporate fortune, they knew the aggressive life insurance company would absolutely refuse to pay out the $5 million policy without a verified physical body. They desperately needed a disposable human corpse to leave trapped inside the burning wreckage. I told him they did not just hire a mechanic to cut my brake lines. they actively hunted down Harper's own highly vulnerable younger sister. They lured a desperate, addicted girl off the dark city streets with the false promise of a warm bed and immediate financial help. They aggressively drugged her into a deep comatose state and physically placed her breathing body into the driver's seat of my heavy sport utility vehicle immediately after the violent crash. They intentionally and maliciously let her burn completely to death in the massive chemical fire just to secure their stolen billionaire lifestyle. Julian began to actively hyperventilate. His chest heaved violently, and hot tears of pure absolute panic streamed rapidly down his bruised, dirty face. He aggressively shook his head from side to side, frantically denying the brutal truth. He screamed loudly that it was a complete and total lie. He shrieked that Harper was the one who actually found the runaway girl and brought her to the dark mountain road. He desperately tried to throw his new wife completely under the federal bus, claiming he never actually touched the girl and that he only helped forge the fake dental records after the massive fire was completely out. He was openly sobbing loudly, begging his adopted sister to believe that he was not a violent monster. Maya stood up, slowly, completely towering over his pathetic, trembling form. She coldly informed him that his frantic, desperate verbal confession did absolutely nothing but officially confirm his active, willing participation in a premeditated capital murder conspiracy. She explicitly told him that Harper was currently sitting in the exact next interrogation room, actively cutting a massive federal plea deal by telling the armed agents that Julian was the exact person who personally drugged her sister and lit the vehicle on fire. They were two greedy, trapped rats violently tearing each other to bloody pieces just to survive the night. Maya explicitly told him that because the murdered victim was a highly vulnerable 20-year-old girl, he was officially facing the absolute maximum penalty under strict federal law. There would be absolutely no comfortable white-collar prison. There would be absolutely no quiet plea deals for corporate financial fraud. He was going straight to a maximum security federal penitentiary for the absolute rest of his natural life without any possibility of early parole. Julian completely collapsed forward in his heavy metal chair. His bruised forehead hit the cold metal table with a dull, heavy thud. He sobbed uncontrollably, his hot tears pooling rapidly on the polished steel surface right next to the damning federal DNA report. He had completely lost absolutely everything. He had lost his massive stolen corporate empire. He had lost his expensive luxury penthouse. He had permanently lost his physical freedom. And he had finally lost the very last shred of his arrogant protective delusion. He was no longer a wealthy, powerful tech visionary. He was a pathetic, exposed murderer, desperately waiting for a cold, dark cage. I looked down at him one final time, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, cold justice. I turned my back on my husband and walked silently out of the interrogation room, leaving him to drown completely in the massive ocean of his own horrific, unforgivable sins. The heavy metal door of the interrogation room stood slightly ajar as the horrific reality of the federal DNA report finally shattered the very last remnants of Julian's fractured sanity. He completely stopped sobbing and began to violently hyperventilate, his chest heaving with massive, desperate gasps for air. The cold clinical confirmation that the burned body belonged to a highly vulnerable 20-year-old girl entirely shifted his legal nightmare from a manageable financial crime into a definitive capital murder charge. He knew exactly what the federal government did to wealthy men who brutally murdered innocent runaway girls for insurance money. The sheer blinding terror violently mutated into a feral, desperate rage. Julian suddenly leaped upward as far as his heavy steel handcuffs would physically allow his metal chair scraping loudly against the hard concrete floor. He turned his bruised, bleeding face toward the adjacent interrogation room and began screaming at the absolute top of his lungs. He violently cursed Harper, name-calling her a greedy, manipulative monster and a sick psychopath. He shrieked frantically to the silent federal agents in the room that the entire horrific murder plot was her exclusive idea. He aggressively claimed that Harper was the one who stalked her younger sister on the dark city streets and personally administered the heavy lethal dose of narcotics before placing her unconscious body into the driver's seat of my vehicle. He begged Maya to believe that he was just a terrified bystander who was completely manipulated by a highly psychotic woman. But the heavy concrete walls of the federal holding facility were absolutely no match for the violent screaming match that immediately erupted. Through the slightly open door, I could clearly hear the muffled but distinct sound of Harper shrieking violently from the adjacent interrogation room. She had clearly heard his desperate loud accusations, and she aggressively fired completely back. Harper was sobbing hysterically, screaming to her own federal interrogators that Julian was a complete pathological liar. She loudly claimed that her wealthy husband was a violent, controlling psychopath who physically threatened to murder her if she did not silently help him secure the massive life insurance payout to save his failing tech company. She shrieked that Julian was the one who physically carried her drugged sister into the heavy sport utility vehicle, and Julian was the exact person who ruthlessly struck the match to ignite the massive chemical fire. The glamorous, highly arrogant couple who had proudly stood on a multi-million-dollar penthouse balcony actively celebrating my supposed brutal murder were now violently tearing each other to bloody shreds. They were two cornered, desperate rats trapped in a sinking metal cage, aggressively chewing off each other's limbs just to survive the rising water. Their deep, profound love was completely exposed as nothing more than a fragile, toxic alliance built entirely on pure, unadulterated financial greed and innocent spilled blood. My meticulous trap had not just successfully captured them, it had actively forced them to become their own ultimate executioners. Maya stood perfectly still, watching her pathetic brother violently thrash against his heavy steel restraints. She calmly reached into her dark leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of official federal arrest warrants. She did not raise her voice over his frantic screaming. She simply began reading the massive escalated charges with a cold, highly authoritative tone that completely commanded the chaotic room. She officially informed Julian that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was completely dropping the simple white-collar wire fraud charges. Instead, she formally charged him with first-degree premeditated murder, federal conspiracy to commit capital murder, massive international money laundering, criminal extortion, and the severe bribery of a senior government medical examiner. She explicitly told him that the federal prosecutor was aggressively seeking the absolute maximum penalty allowed by law. Because the horrific crime crossed multiple state lines regarding the offshore banking and involved a highly vulnerable victim, the federal government had absolute complete jurisdiction. There would be absolutely no state-level leniency and absolutely no quiet corporate plea deals. Maya strictly informed him that the federal authorities had already successfully seized every single dollar of his stolen wealth. His expensive luxury penthouse was currently being heavily raided by armed tactical agents. His massive tech startup was completely dissolved and actively placed into immediate federal receivership. His elite venture capital investors were actively filing massive civil lawsuits that would completely drain his remaining hidden assets. Julian slowly stopped screaming. He slumped heavily forward onto the cold metal table, his bruised cheek resting directly against the cold polished steel. He stared blankly at the bright white wall, completely stripped of his money, his freedom, and his arrogance, insanity. He finally realized that his expensive corporate defense lawyers were absolutely never going to answer his desperate phone calls. They completely abandoned him the very second the federal government officially froze his massive bank accounts, because a broke murderer cannot pay $1 million legal retainer. He was completely and utterly alone in the world. 2 days later, I sat quietly in the back row of the heavily guarded federal courthouse and watched the final heavy nail driven firmly into his dark coffin. The federal judge looked down at Julian and Harper with absolute pure judicial disgust. He explicitly called them a severe ongoing danger to modern society and a massive flight risk. The judge aggressively slammed his heavy wooden gavel, completely denying them both any possibility of financial bail. The heavy steel chains clinked loudly around their waists as the federal marshals aggressively hauled them out of the bright courtroom. They were violently dragged back to their dark, isolated concrete cells, where they would spend the absolute rest of their miserable lives rotting in total obscurity without any hope of appeal. They had brutally tried to bury me in the dark to steal my bright, beautiful world. But in the end, I completely took my world back and buried them absolutely alive inside a cold federal prison. The crisp autumn wind blew gently across the heavy stone steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle. I stood tall and proud beside Maya, watching the heavy armored transport van carrying Julian and Harper disappear completely into the busy city traffic forever. They were chained tightly together in the dark, heading straight toward a permanent life sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. It was finally over. The long, grueling legal battle had officially concluded just a few short hours ago. With my husband completely locked away and his massive federal audio confession fully verified, the civil courts moved with unprecedented speed to correct his massive financial crimes. I had legally and completely dissolved our highly toxic marriage. Every single stolen dollar of my massive life insurance payout was fully recovered from his hidden offshore accounts and safely returned directly to my protected legacy trust. But the absolute best part of the final legal judgment was the total corporate restitution. To completely compensate me for the severe emotional trauma and the massive financial damages, the federal judge explicitly ordered the total seizure of Julian's entire tech startup. I was now the sole absolute owner of the very empire he had brutally sacrificed an innocent girl to aggressively protect. I had already immediately fired his entire corrupt executive board. I began rapidly restructuring the massive company to actively fund a powerful new charitable foundation entirely dedicated to helping vulnerable, runaway young women safely escape the dark, dangerous city streets. Maya smiled warmly at me, pulling her dark navy trench coat tightly around her shoulders. She softly told me that she was incredibly proud of the fiercely strong woman I had completely transformed into. I hugged my brilliant, beautiful sister tightly, feeling the genuine, profound bond forged deeply in the fire of our shared victory. She had truly been my ultimate savior in the darkest moments of my entire life. I turned my face toward the majestic Seattle skyline, taking a very deep, slow breath of the cold, clean air. I was absolutely no longer a betrayed, dead wife trapped in a dark, cold mountain clinic. I had clawed my way completely out of the bloody grave they hastily dug for me, and I had successfully built an absolute invincible fortress right on top of their completely ruined lives. I was finally breathing the crisp, fresh air of a powerful woman who had forcefully crowned herself a true queen. They thought burying me was the end of the story. They forgot that some women are seeds. When you bury us in the dark, we do not rot. We grow roots and we tear apart the concrete when we rise. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it where you are watching this video and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below.